The gunman's voice cut through the cafe like a blade. Nobody moves. Lydia Crow, CEO, power broker, woman who'd built empires on ruthless calculation, froze as cold metal pressed against her temple. Across the table, the man she'd spent 20 minutes mocking, the single father with calloused hands she'd deemed beneath her notice, met her terrified gaze with unsettling calm. "Stay still," Evan Miller whispered, his voice carrying an authority that didn't match his worn jacket or quiet demeanor. "When I move, get low." In the chaos that followed, Lydia would learn the most expensive lesson of her life: that true power doesn't announce itself with designer suits and corner offices, and the strongest person in any room is often the one nobody sees coming. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about strength, pride, and second chances. The morning had started exactly as Lydia Crow preferred, under her complete control. She arrived at Madeline's, the upscale cafe in Chicago's Gold Coast district, precisely 7 minutes early. Not 10, which would suggest desperation, and certainly not late, which would imply disrespect for her own time. 7 minutes provided the perfect buffer to claim the best table, order her usual oat milk cortado, and establish territorial dominance before her date arrived. The term date felt generous. Lydia considered it more of a social audit, a perfunctory meeting arranged by her sister Claire, who'd grown insufferably concerned about Lydia's emotional isolation following the divorce. As if emotional isolation wasn't a strategic advantage in the cutthroat world of high-stakes finance. "You need to put yourself out there," Claire had insisted during their last phone call, her voice carrying that particular blend of sisterly concern and judgment that made Lydia's jaw tighten. "Not everyone is like Marcus. There are good men in the world." Lydia had almost laughed. Good men. As if goodness mattered in a world that rewarded cunning, ambition, and the willingness to strike first. Marcus had seemed good too, with his Ivy League pedigree and family connections, right up until she'd discovered him in their bed with his 23-year-old assistant. The memory still burned, not from heartbreak, but from the humiliation of being caught off guard, of having her judgment proven fallible. Never again. She'd rebuilt herself in the 2 years since, transforming Crow Capital from a mid-tier investment firm into one of Chicago's most aggressive hedge funds. Her reputation preceded her now. Brilliant, merciless, uncompromising, exactly as she intended. The cafe hummed with the refined energy of old money and new fortunes mixing over handcrafted pastries. Lydia chose a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances, a habit from her years of corporate warfare, always maintaining tactical awareness. She settled into the leather chair, crossed her legs beneath her tailored Armani suit, and prepared to endure whatever well-meaning mediocrity Claire had inflicted upon her schedule. Evan Miller appeared at 9:02 a.m., exactly on time, which Lydia noted with faint approval before her critical assessment began in earnest. He was taller than she'd expected from Claire's description, perhaps 6'1", with broad shoulders that filled out a navy jacket that had seen better days. The fabric was clean but worn at the elbows, the kind of wear that spoke of years rather than deliberate vintage styling. His jeans were similarly honest, functional denim without designer distressing or premium branding. Work boots, she noted with barely concealed disdain. Actual work boots, scuffed and practical, in a cafe where most men wore Italian leather. His face carried a weathered quality that suggested outdoor labor rather than gym memberships. Strong jawline, dark hair showing the first threads of silver at the temples, and eyes that swept the room with unexpected alertness before settling on her. They were gray-blue, she noticed, and disconcertingly direct. "Lydia?" His voice was deeper than she'd anticipated, with a Midwest flatness that lacked the polished diction of her usual circles. "Mr. Miller." She didn't stand, merely extended her hand with the minimum courtesy required. His palm was warm and heavily calloused against hers, the hands of someone who actually worked for a living, not just managed portfolios and board meetings. "Evan's fine." He took the seat across from her with an economy of movement that seemed almost military in its efficiency. No awkward adjusting, no nervous fidgeting. He simply sat, met her eyes, and waited. The silence stretched for 3 beats too long. Lydia was accustomed to controlling conversations, but she'd expected him to fill the void with nervous chatter, the usual masculine posturing of men trying to impress her. Instead, he remained quiet, his expression neutral and faintly expectant. She decided to seize the initiative. "I'll be honest, Mr. Miller. Evan. I'll be honest, Evan. I'm only here as a favor to my sister. I'm not particularly interested in dating, and I suspect we have very little in common." She delivered the words with surgical precision, designed to establish boundaries and manage expectations. "However, since we're both here, we might as well have coffee like civilized adults." "Fair?" Something flickered in those gray-blue eyes. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. "Fair enough. Though I should mention, your sister told me the exact same thing about you." Lydia blinked. "Excuse me?" "That you weren't particularly interested in dating and probably wouldn't like me much." He leaned back slightly, completely at ease with her hostility. "She also said you needed someone who wouldn't be intimidated by your success, wouldn't try to compete with you professionally, and wouldn't mistake your armor for the actual person underneath." The accuracy of the assessment caught Lydia off guard, which she hated. "My sister overshares. She cares about you. She meddles. Sometimes that's the same thing." Evan's expression softened with something that looked like genuine understanding. "I have a younger brother who does the same. Drives me crazy, but I know it comes from love." A server appeared, impeccably dressed and attentive. Evan ordered black coffee and politely declined the pastry menu. Lydia requested her cortado with specific instructions about foam temperature and texture, aware that her precision might seem excessive but unwilling to compromise her standards. When the server departed, Lydia decided to accelerate the evaluation process. The sooner she could report back to Claire that this was a catastrophic mismatch, the sooner she could return to her actual life. "So, Evan, Claire mentioned you're a contractor?" She infused the question with just enough emphasis to make her skepticism clear. "General maintenance and facilities management," he confirmed without defensiveness. "Mostly commercial properties, some residential. I handle everything from HVAC systems to structural repairs." Lydia's lip curved with barely suppressed condescension. "So you're essentially a handyman?" "I'm essentially someone who ensures buildings don't collapse and people don't freeze in winter," Evan replied evenly. "But yes, handyman works if it makes the category easier for you." The gentle correction should have annoyed her. Instead, it sparked something sharper, a desire to crack that unflappable calm. "And that supports you adequately? The handyman business?" She knew she was being cruel now, deploying her boardroom tactics in a social setting, but some part of her needed to see him flinch. "It supports me and my daughter comfortably," Evan said, his tone unchanged. "We have what we need, and I'm home for dinner every night. That matters more than the size of the paycheck." "You have a child?" This detail Claire had somehow failed to mention, and Lydia felt a fresh wave of annoyance at the omission. "Sophie. She's 7. Evan's entire demeanor shifted when he said his daughter's name, something fundamental softening in his expression. "Smart as hell, obsessed with dinosaurs, thinks she's going to be a paleontologist when she grows up." "And her mother?" Lydia asked bluntly, deciding subtlety was wasted effort. "Died when Sophie was 2. The words were matter of fact, but Lydia caught the practiced quality of the delivery, grief worn smooth by repetition. "Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed and gone in 4 months." For the first time that morning, Lydia felt the sharp edge of her judgment dull slightly. She knew loss, though hers had been chosen rather than inflicted. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Evan accepted the condolence with a slight nod, neither milking the sympathy nor deflecting it entirely. "It was 5 years ago. We've learned to carry it." Their drinks arrived, providing a brief interruption. Lydia studied him over the rim of her cup, recalibrating. The calloused hands made more sense now, a man working to provide for his child alone. The worn jacket became less about poverty and more about priorities. She should feel some compassion, some softening of her initial contempt. Instead, she felt only a distant acknowledgement of his circumstances. Nothing more. "Claire said you run an investment firm," Evan said, redirecting the conversation with unexpected grace. "Crow Capital?" "I founded it 2 years ago after my divorce," Lydia confirmed, allowing pride to seep into her voice. We've grown to manage over $3 billion in assets. I specialize in aggressive short-term plays, identifying undervalued companies, restructuring them, and maximizing returns within 18 to 24 months. You buy struggling companies and flip them, Evans summarized. The simplification rankled. I acquire assets that are inefficiently managed, eliminate waste, streamline operations, and unlock shareholder value. And the people who worked for those companies before you streamlined them. Evans' question was mild, curious rather than accusatory, but Lydia felt the implicit critique. Find new employment suited to their actual skill levels, she replied coolly. The market rewards efficiency, Mr. Miller. I don't create the rules, I simply play by them better than my competitors. Evan, he corrected again with infinite patience. And I'm not judging, just trying to understand what drives someone to build something that aggressive, that fast. Lydia set her cup down with deliberate precision. What drives me is refusing to be vulnerable ever again. Power isn't about comfort, Evan. It's about ensuring no one can ever hurt you, betray you, or make you feel small. I control my world now, completely. That's worth any price. She expected defensiveness, maybe moral posturing about values and integrity. Instead, Evan simply studied her with those unsettling gray-blue eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried unexpected weight. That sounds incredibly lonely. The observation landed like a physical blow. Lydia felt her carefully constructed walls quiver, and she responded with the only weapon she had left, escalation. Loneliness is a choice I make consciously, she said, her voice hardening to ice. Unlike poverty, which I assume was yours before you settled for repairing other people's air conditioning. It was cruel, calculated, designed to wound. Lydia watched Evan's expression, waiting for anger, for him to stand and walk away, for confirmation that she'd successfully driven off another well-meaning attempt at connection. But Evan didn't flinch. He didn't react at all, really, except for the faintest tightening at the corners of his eyes. Not hurt, but something closer to recognition. You know what's interesting? Evan said quietly, leaning forward slightly. You've been trying to make me angry or ashamed since I sat down. Testing me, pushing buttons, seeing where I'll break. I'm guessing that's how you protect yourself. Attack first. Stay in control. Never let anyone close enough to matter. Lydia felt her pulse quicken, uncomfortable with his accuracy. Amateur psychology doesn't impress me. I'm not trying to impress you, Evan replied. I'm just noticing that someone hurt you badly enough that you've turned yourself into a weapon. And I'm sorry for that, Lydia. Not because I think you're weak, clearly you're not, but because it must be exhausting, living like you're always under siege. The words bypassed every defense she'd constructed, sliding between the cracks of her armor with devastating precision. For a dangerous moment, Lydia felt something shift in her chest, something that might have been tears if she still allowed herself that vulnerability. She crushed it immediately. You don't know anything about me, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. You show up in your charity shop jacket with your blue-collar job and your tragic backstory, and you think that gives you insight into my life? You're a maintenance worker, Evan. You fix toilets and change light bulbs. I move markets and destroy competitors before breakfast. We're not even in the same universe. This time, she saw it. The flash of something harder in Evan's expression, quickly controlled. When he spoke, his voice remained level, but she caught the steel beneath it. You're right, he said. We're in different universes. You've built one where success is measured by how much you can take and how many people you can beat. I live in one where success is my daughter smiling at breakfast and knowing she's safe, loved, and will grow up understanding that strength isn't the same as cruelty. He stood then, moving with that same economical grace, and pulled out his wallet. He placed a 20 on the table, far more than his coffee cost. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Lydia. I really do. But I don't think it's going to be in places like this, with people you've already decided to despise. Lydia watched him turn toward the door, and some part of her, some small, strangled part she'd been ignoring for 2 years, wanted to call him back, to apologize, to admit that she'd been testing him because everyone who'd ever claimed to care had eventually proven unworthy of trust. But pride won, as it always did. Enjoy your mediocre life, she called after him, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. I'm sure it's very fulfilling, fixing other people's problems while barely keeping your own head above water. Evan paused, his back to her, and Lydia felt a moment of vicious satisfaction. She'd landed a blow after all. When he turned back, though, his expression held only sadness. "You know what the real tragedy is, Lydia. You're so busy winning that you can't see you've already lost everything that matters." He walked away then, moving toward the door with steady purpose. Lydia lifted her cortado with a slightly trembling hand, telling herself she felt nothing but relief at his departure. That's when she noticed them. 3 men, scattered throughout the cafe, all moving with synchronized precision. They weren't looking at menus or checking phones. They were watching exits, tracking positions, communicating with subtle gestures that Lydia's corporate instincts recognized as coordination. Something was wrong. She saw Evan notice them too, his stride faltering for just a fraction of a second before continuing, his shoulders tensing in a way that suddenly seemed less like casual movement and more like controlled preparation. One of the men near the door shifted his stance, and Lydia caught the unmistakable outline of something heavy beneath his jacket. Her breath caught. Gun. The cafe's refined morning energy continued undisturbed around her. Mothers with strollers, business professionals typing on laptops, an elderly couple sharing a croissant. No one else had noticed the predators moving between the tables, except Evan. He'd changed direction, no longer heading for the exit but angling toward the counter where a mother stood with her young son, maybe 4 years old, completely unaware of the danger circling closer. Lydia's mind raced through scenarios with the same analytical speed she applied to market analysis. Armed robbery? Targeted hit? Domestic terrorism? The specifics mattered less than the mathematics. 3 armed men, dozens of civilians, enclosed space with limited exits. She should run. Every survival instinct screamed at her to move now, while the gunmen were focused elsewhere. She was 15 feet from a side door marked staff only. If she moved quickly, quietly, she could... The nearest gunman's eyes locked onto hers. Everything stopped. Time compressed into a single point of perfect crystalline terror. She saw him register her awareness, saw his hand move toward his jacket, saw the calculation in his expression that meant she'd just become a problem requiring a solution. Then Evan was there, somehow covering the distance between them faster than should have been possible, his body suddenly between her and the threat, his voice low and urgent in her ear. "When I tell you to move, get behind the counter and stay low. Don't argue. Don't hesitate. Understand?" Lydia couldn't speak. Couldn't think beyond the roaring white noise of panic flooding her system. She managed a tiny nod. "Good." Evan's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady, and incredibly, impossibly, she felt some of the terror recede. "Stay calm. Breathe. You're going to be okay." The gunman closest to them stepped forward, his hand now visibly wrapped around something metallic inside his jacket. His voice carried across the cafe with devastating casualness. "Nobody moves. Nobody screams. Everyone stays exactly where they are. And nobody has to die today." The cafe erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the air as civilians finally understood the danger. People dropped to the floor, scrambled for exits, overturned tables in blind panic. The refined morning atmosphere shattered into primal terror. Lydia froze, every muscle locked, her brilliant analytical mind reduced to static and fear. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her in places like this during ordinary Tuesday mornings. A second gunman fired into the ceiling, a sharp, devastating crack that silenced the screaming and froze the fleeing. Plaster rained down. Someone whimpered. The smell of gunpowder cut through the cafe's previous scent of fresh pastries and expensive coffee. "I said nobody moves," the first gunman repeated, his voice harder now. "Everyone on the ground. Hands visible. Phones out where we can see them." Lydia's legs buckled, and she started to drop, but Evan caught her, his grip firm but gentle, lowering her with controlled precision rather than letting her collapse. "Breathe," he whispered, so quietly only she could hear. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Do it now." Impossibly, absurdly, she obeyed, drew air into her paralyzed lungs, held it, released it. The simple mechanics of respiration pulled her back from the edge of complete panic. Around them, people pressed themselves against the floor. Children sobbed. The elderly couple clutched each other. A young woman in yoga clothes hyperventilated into her hands. The three gunmen moved through the space with practiced efficiency, collecting phones and wallets into a bag, barking orders, maintaining control through the credible threat of violence. Lydia watched them work, her mind beginning to function again beneath the terror. This wasn't random. The coordination was too precise, the timing too practiced. They'd planned this, studied the cafe's patterns, chosen this specific morning for specific reasons, which meant it wasn't just robbery. Robbery didn't require this much preparation. She turned her head slightly, seeking Evan's face, needing some anchor in the nightmare. He was watching the gunmen with an intensity that seemed disconnected from fear, mapping their movements, tracking their positioning, calculating something she couldn't identify. "What are they doing?" she whispered, barely breathing the words. "Waiting," Evan replied, his voice absolutely steady. "They're not here for the money." As if to confirm his assessment, the third gunman, younger than the others, with wild eyes that suggested either drugs or ideology, began moving through the hostages more aggressively, yanking people up to check their faces against something on his phone. He was looking for someone specific. The terrible understanding hit Lydia like ice water, target acquisition. They were searching for a particular person, someone they'd tracked to this cafe, and everyone else was just collateral. The young gunman's search brought him closer to where Lydia and Evan lay. She felt Evan's hand tighten on her shoulder, not fear, but warning, preparation. When the gunman reached them, he grabbed Lydia's chin roughly, forcing her face up toward his phone. She caught a glimpse of multiple photographs on his screen, none of which matched her features. "Not her," the gunman muttered, shoving her back down. He moved to Evan next, yanking him up with the same rough handling. Lydia saw Evan's jaw tighten, saw his hands, those calloused, working hands she'd mocked 20 minutes ago, clench once before deliberately relaxing. The gunman checked his face against the phone, then frowned. Wait. Whatever recognition sparked in his expression never finished forming. Because that's when the young mother near the counter moved, trying to shield her 4-year-old son more completely, and the movement drew the gunman's attention. He turned, raising his weapon, and Lydia saw with horrible clarity that his finger was tightening on the trigger, that his drug-hazed eyes showed no calculation or restraint, that he was about to shoot a child for the crime of moving. Evan was already in motion. He moved faster than Lydia would have thought possible for a man his size, covering the distance to the gunman in 3 explosive strides. His hand clamped around the weapon, forcing the barrel toward the ceiling just as it discharged, another deafening crack that sent fresh screams through the cafe. Then Evan did something Lydia's brain struggled to process. He didn't fight for the gun, didn't try to wrestle it away or strike the gunman. Instead, he moved closer, his free hand coming up to the young man's face, his voice dropping to urgent intimacy. "Hey, look at me. Look at my eyes." The gunman thrashed, trying to aim the weapon back toward the hostages, but Evan's grip was absolute. His hand remained gentle on the gunman's face, forcing eye contact. "You don't want to do this," Evan continued, his voice somehow carrying through the chaos with complete calm. "I can see it in you, whatever they promised, whatever you think you're doing here. This isn't you. That little boy reminds you of someone, doesn't he? Maybe your brother, your nephew?" The gunman's eyes widened, his resistance faltering. "He's terrified," Evan said softly. "Just like you are. Just like all of us. But you can end this. Right now. You can be the one who chooses different." For one suspended moment, Lydia thought it might actually work. The young gunman's expression cracked, showing the frightened boy beneath the violence, and his grip on the weapon loosened. Then the second gunman appeared behind Evan, his weapon pressed against the base of Evan's skull. "Let him go," the second gunman ordered, his voice colder than his companion's, showing none of the same vulnerability. "Now, or I paint the floor with your skull." Evan's hands released immediately, rising in surrender, but his eyes never left the young gunman's face. "You can still choose," he said quietly. "It's not too late." The young gunman stepped back, his weapon shaking now, his face showing the war between who he'd been and who he was being forced to become. The second gunman pistol-whipped Evan across the face. The sound was sickening, metal meeting bone with brutal efficiency. Evan dropped hard, blood streaming from a split above his eye, and Lydia heard herself scream before conscious thought could stop the sound. The gunman who'd struck Evan turned toward her, and she saw death in his expression, saw him raising the weapon, saw her own mortality approaching with terrible clarity. She thought of her empire, her carefully constructed power, the lonely victories she'd accumulated like armor against a world that had hurt her once and would never be allowed to do so again, all of it meaningless in the face of cold metal and colder intent. Then Evan was moving again, impossibly, rolling through his own blood and grabbing the gunman's ankle, pulling hard. The gunman stumbled, his shot going wide, the bullet punching through the cafe's front window in an explosion of safety glass. Sirens erupted in the distance, growing rapidly closer. The three gunmen exchanged quick glances, their practiced coordination fracturing into panic. They hadn't planned for resistance, hadn't expected anyone to fight back. The mathematical certainty of their control was dissolving, and Lydia saw them making rapid calculations. "Forget the target," the first gunman snapped. "Grab hostages for leverage, move!" The young gunman seized the mother and child near the counter, dragging them toward the back of the cafe. The second gunman grabbed a businessman and an elderly woman, forcing them against the wall. The third, the one who'd struck Evan, grabbed Lydia. His hand locked around her throat, dragging her upright with bruising force. Lydia clawed at his grip, unable to breathe, her vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. "Drop it!" The gunman's voice roared across the cafe, his weapon now pressed against Lydia's temple. "Everyone stays back or she dies." Through her failing vision, Lydia saw Evan on his knees, blood streaming down his face, his hands raised but his eyes locked on hers with laser focus. "Let her go," Evan said, his voice carrying authority that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than civilian life. "You don't need her. Take me instead." "I don't need either of you," the gunman snarled, "but I'll kill both if anyone moves." The sirens were louder now, close enough that Lydia could distinguish individual vehicles. Police? SWAT, probably. The cavalry arriving too late to prevent the nightmare, but potentially in time to end it, or escalate it into a massacre. The gunman's grip tightened on her throat. "Tell them to back off. Tell them we'll start executing hostages if they breach." Lydia couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Black spots danced across her vision. She felt her body going limp, felt consciousness slipping away like water through cupped hands. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Evan's eyes. Steady, determined, absolutely fearless. And the strange, certain knowledge that he would die trying to save her. Even after everything she'd said, even after all her cruelty. The world went black. Consciousness returned in fragments. Pain first, sharp and insistent at her throat. Then sound, muffled voices shouting commands, and finally awareness. The terrible understanding that she was still alive when she shouldn't be. Lydia's eyes snapped open to chaos contained. The gunman's grip had loosened just enough for air to return to her lungs in desperate, ragged gasps. She was on the floor again, the cold tile pressing against her cheek, and through her blurred vision she could see police lights strobing red and blue through the cafe's shattered window. "Nobody comes in!" The first gunman's voice cracked with rising panic. "We have hostages. We will execute them." Lydia turned her head, ignoring the screaming protest from her bruised throat, and found Evan. He was still on his knees 10 feet away, hands raised, blood painting the left side of his face in a grotesque mask. But his eyes were clear, focused, tracking every movement of the three gunmen with unnerving precision. Their gazes met, and something passed between them. Not words, not even understanding, but acknowledgement. She was alive because of him, because he'd offered himself in her place, because he'd fought when fighting was suicide, because some fundamental part of his nature refused to let innocent people die without resistance. The man she'd spent 20 minutes destroying with casual cruelty had just saved her life. The young gunman still held the mother and her son against the far wall, his weapon shaking so badly now that it seemed more dangerous than steadying. The child was sobbing, high-pitched wails of pure terror that cut through every other sound. His mother whispered desperately into his hair, trying to soothe him, her own face streaked with tears. "Shut that kid up," the second gunman barked, his weapon swinging toward them. "Shut him up now or I'll give him a reason to cry." "He's 4 years old," the mother choked out. "Please, he's just a baby. He doesn't understand. I don't care if he's the president's kid. Make him be quiet." The mother tried, pressing her hand over her son's mouth, but the boy's terror was beyond rational control. His screams only intensified, muffled now, but no less desperate. Lydia watched the second gunman's face harden into something final and knew with absolute certainty that he was about to shoot the child. Not because the crying posed any actual threat, but because his control was slipping and violence was the only tool he understood for reclaiming it. "Wait!" Evan's voice cut through the chaos with unexpected authority. "Let me talk to him." The gunman's weapon swung toward Evan. "You don't talk unless I tell you to talk." "You want him quiet. I can make that happen," Evan continued, his tone absolutely steady despite the gun pointed at his face. "I work with kids. I know how to calm them down. 60 seconds, that's all I need." "You think I'm stupid?" The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. "You think I'm letting you get close to them so you can play hero again?" "I think you want the noise to stop before the police use it as an excuse to breach," Evan replied, his voice dropping into something that sounded almost conversational. "And I think shooting a 4-year-old on camera." He gestured slightly toward the cafe's security system, its red recording light still active, "is going to make this situation a lot worse for you when it's over." The first gunman, who seemed to be the leader of the three, stepped forward. He was older than his companions, maybe 40, with the kind of lean, weathered face that suggested military training gone wrong. When he spoke, his voice carried calculation rather than panic. "You've got 30 seconds, he told Evan. "Hands visible at all times. You try anything. We shoot the mother first, then the kid, then you. Clear?" "Clear." Evan slowly lowered his hands, moving with exaggerated care as he stood. Lydia saw him sway slightly. The blow to his head had been severe, but he steadied himself and began walking toward the mother and child with measured, non-threatening steps. The young gunman backed away slightly, giving Evan space but keeping his weapon trained on the mother's head. Lydia could see the conflict still raging in the young man's expression, the part of him that wanted to believe Evan's earlier words warring with whatever desperation or indoctrination had brought him to this moment. Evan knelt slowly, putting himself at eye level with the terrified child. The boy was hyperventilating now, his small chest heaving with each breath, his eyes wide and unfocused with shock. "Hey, buddy," Evan said softly, his voice transformed into something gentle and warm that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "My name's Evan. What's yours?" The child couldn't answer, couldn't do anything but sob and shake. "That's okay," Evan continued, his tone never wavering. "You don't have to talk, but I need you to listen to me for just a minute. Can you do that? Can you look at me?" Slowly, painfully, the boy's eyes focused on Evan's face. The blood didn't seem to frighten him. Perhaps he was too young to fully understand what it meant. Or perhaps Evan's voice was simply that compelling. "Good job," Evan said. "You're doing great. Now, I know you're scared. I know this is really, really scary, but I need you to be brave for your mom, okay? She needs you to be brave right now." "I want to go home," the child whimpered, the first coherent words he'd spoken since the violence began. "I know you do. We all do. And we're going to very soon, but first we need to wait quietly, like a game. Can you play the quiet game with me?" The child's sobs began to subside, reduced to hiccuping breaths. His mother watched Evan with desperate gratitude, one hand still pressed protectively against her son's back. "Here's what we're going to do," Evan said, his voice taking on a storytelling quality that somehow made the nightmare feel less immediate. "We're going to count together, really quietly, just moving our lips, no sound. And every time we get to 10, we're going to take one big, deep breath. Your mom is going to do it with us. Ready?" The child nodded, a tiny movement, but it was engagement, connection, the beginning of emotional regulation in a brain too young to manage it alone. "Okay. 1, 2, 3. Lydia watched, transfixed, as Evan counted with the boy through 3 full cycles. By the end, the child's breathing had normalized, his sobs replaced by focused concentration on the numbers. The cafe had gone quiet around them, everyone else holding their breath as they witnessed something impossible, humanity persisting in the middle of inhumanity. "You did it," Evan told the boy, his smile genuine despite the blood still streaming down his face. "You were so brave. Your mom is really proud of you." "I am," the mother whispered, her voice breaking. So proud, baby. Evan started to stand, his mission accomplished, but the boy's small hand shot out and grabbed his sleeve. Don't go, the child pleaded. Stay here. Something cracked in Evan's expression. Grief, maybe, or recognition of his own daughter in this terrified child. I have to go back over there, buddy. But I promise you're going to be okay. Your mom's going to keep you safe. But you kept me safe, the boy said with the brutal logic of childhood. You made it better. Lydia saw Evan's throat work, saw him struggling with words that wouldn't come. Finally, he just squeezed the child's hand gently and stood, backing away with visible reluctance. The first gunman had watched the entire exchange with unreadable eyes. Now he gestured curtly with his weapon. Back on the floor, face down. Evan complied, lowering himself carefully. As he did, his eyes found Lydia's again, and she saw exhaustion there now, and pain, but also something else. Determination. The kind that didn't quit just because the odds were impossible. Outside, a voice boomed through a megaphone. This is the Chicago Police Department. The building is surrounded. Release the hostages and come out with your hands up. This is your only chance to resolve this peacefully. The first gunman moved to the shattered window, staying carefully out of sight lines. We want a vehicle, SUV, full tank, no tracking devices. You have 10 minutes or we start executing hostages. That's not going to happen, the megaphone voice replied, and Lydia recognized the cadence of professional negotiation. But we can talk about this. What do you need? What's your goal here? Our goal is getting out of here alive. The gunman's voice was rising again, control slipping. 10 minutes! Clock's ticking. Lydia's analytical mind, finally recovering from the shock, began processing the tactical situation. The gunmen were trapped. Their original plan, whatever it had been, completely derailed. They hadn't expected resistance, hadn't planned for a siege situation, and now they were improvising badly. Classic panic response, which made them exponentially more dangerous. The police wouldn't give them a vehicle. That was negotiation 101. Never provide mobility to hostage takers, which meant the gunmen's demands would be refused. Their desperation would escalate, and eventually violence would become inevitable. She needed to think, needed to find an angle, some leverage she could exploit. This wasn't so different from hostile takeover negotiations, identifying what each party truly wanted versus what they claimed to want, finding the pressure points, exploiting the cracks in their unity. The young gunman was the obvious weak link. Evan had already exposed his vulnerability, the part of him that didn't want to be here, that didn't want to hurt anyone. If she could somehow amplify that doubt, turn him against his companions. But to do that, she'd need to speak. And speaking meant drawing attention to herself again, meant risking another hand around her throat, another gun to her temple. Every survival instinct screamed at her to stay still, stay quiet, wait for the professionals to resolve this. Except Evan had already proven that waiting passively could mean death for the innocent. Lydia took a shaky breath, her bruised throat protesting, and made a choice she would have deemed insane 24 hours ago. She pushed herself up slightly, enough to look at the young gunman. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice hoarse and barely audible. All three gunmen turned toward her. The second one, the one who'd struck Evan, started forward with his weapon raised, but the leader stopped him with a sharp gesture. What did you say? The leader demanded. Lydia forced herself to hold his gaze, to speak through the fear clogging her throat. He doesn't have to do this. None of you do. It's not too late to make a different choice. Shut up, the second gunman snarled. You don't know anything about our choices. I know you had one before you walked in here with guns, Lydia continued, the words coming faster now as her boardroom instincts kicked in. And you have another one right now. You can end this. You can let these people go. And then what? The leader's voice was sharp with bitter amusement. We go to prison for 30 years? We become examples for the evening news? No thanks. Better than dying here, Lydia shot back. Because that's where this is heading. The police aren't giving you a vehicle. They're not letting you leave. Your only options are surrender or death. And surrender means you might actually have a future. The leader took 2 quick steps toward her, and Lydia braced for violence, but he stopped just short, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. You want to know what brought us here? He said quietly. his voice carrying a venom that made her flinch. People like you, rich, entitled, taking everything while the rest of us scramble for scraps. You sit in your gold-plated cafe, sipping $8 coffee while people are losing their homes, their health care, their hope. So you decided to shoot up a cafe? Lydia kept her voice level despite the tremor in her hands. That helps, how exactly? It sends a message, the leader replied. It reminds people like you that you're not untouchable, that your money and your power don't protect you from consequences. What it does, Evan's voice cut in from the floor, is hurt innocent people who have nothing to do with whatever grievances you're carrying. The second gunman moved toward Evan, weapon raised to strike again, but the leader stopped him with a sharp hand gesture. You had your moment of heroism, the leader told Evan. Don't push for another one. I'm not trying to be a hero, Evan said, his voice steady. I'm trying to understand what you actually want. Because from where I'm lying, this looks like anger without direction, violence without purpose. Our purpose, the young gunman started, but the leader silenced him with a look. Our purpose is our business, the leader said coldly. He turned back to the shattered window. 8 minutes left. Where's our vehicle? The negotiator's voice came back, deliberately calm. We need more time. These things take coordination. Let's talk about releasing some hostages as a show of good faith. Start with the child and his mother. No deal, the leader snapped. You want hostages released? You give us what we asked for. I can't do that without authorization from my superiors. But if you release the child, I can— 7 minutes! The leader was unraveling now, his careful control dissolving into panic. Stop stalling and get us that SUV. Lydia watched the dynamic deteriorating and knew they were approaching a critical juncture. The longer this went on, the more desperate the gunman became, the higher the chance of catastrophic violence. She looked at Evan, found him already watching her, and saw the same calculation in his eyes. He gave her the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. Trust me. She had no reason to trust him. Every principle she'd built her life around said that trust was vulnerability, that vulnerability was weakness, that weakness was death. But the man she'd mocked and dismissed had already saved her life once, had calmed a terrified child, had offered himself as a sacrifice without hesitation. Lydia nodded back, a millimeter of movement that meant everything. Evan's eyes shifted to the young gunman, then back to Lydia, then to the leader. He was mapping something, planning something, and Lydia felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and terror. The kid needs water, Evan said suddenly. He's been crying hard enough that he's going to get dehydrated. Let me get him some water from behind the counter. You think I'm stupid? The second gunman sneered. You think we're letting you wander around? He's right, though, the young gunman said quietly. The kid needs water. We're not trying to hurt children. We're not trying to hurt anyone, the leader corrected sharply. If they cooperate, but we can't have people moving around. So come with me, Evan offered. Keep your gun on me the whole time. I just want to get the kid some water, that's it. The leader studied Evan for a long moment, clearly weighing the risk against the potential benefit of keeping hostages healthy and compliant. Finally, he nodded to the young gunman. You go with him, gun to his back. He makes one wrong move, you shoot him. The young gunman swallowed hard but nodded. Evan stood slowly, hands visible, and began walking toward the counter with the young gunman following close behind, weapon pressed between his shoulder blades. Lydia watched them go, her mind racing. This was it. Whatever Evan was planning, it was happening now. She needed to be ready to move, to act, to do something other than lie helplessly on the floor. Behind the counter, Evan reached for a bottle of water with deliberate slowness. The young gunman watched him, tension radiating from every line of his body. What's your name? Evan asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only the young gunman could hear clearly. Doesn't matter. It matters to me. You've got a gun to my back and you might kill me in the next 30 seconds. I'd like to know the name of the person making that choice. The young gunman's weapon wavered slightly. Marcus. Marcus, Evan repeated, turning slightly so they were almost facing each other. How old are you, Marcus? 22. Same age I was when I enlisted, Evan said, his voice carrying a weight that made Lydia's breath catch. Marines. Thought I was going to save the world, fight the good fight, make a difference. You know what I learned? Marcus didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. That violence is the easiest choice and the hardest one to live with after. That the people you hurt stay with you forever, even when you tell yourself they deserved it. That real courage isn't pulling a trigger, it's choosing not to. You don't understand, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. You don't know what we've been through, what they took from us. You're right, I don't, Evan acknowledged. But I know that 4-year-old over there had nothing to do with it. I know his mother didn't do anything to deserve this. And I know that whatever justification you're carrying, it's not going to feel like enough when you're trying to sleep and all you can see is the faces of the people you hurt. Marcus's weapon was shaking violently now. Tears streaked his face. I can't. They'll kill me if I... Not if you're already in police custody, Evan said quietly. Not if you surrender first, help them end this without more bloodshed. You become the hero instead of the villain, Marcus. You become the one who saved lives instead of ending them. For a moment, Lydia thought it might work, thought Marcus might lower his weapon, might choose differently, might prove that redemption was possible even in the middle of a nightmare. Then the leader's voice cut across the cafe like a whip. What's taking so long back there? Marcus flinched, the spell broken. His weapon steadied, pressing harder against Evan's spine. Nothing. We're coming. Evan grabbed the water bottle and turned, moving back toward the main cafe area with Marcus following. As they passed near where Lydia lay, Evan's eyes met hers again, and she saw disappointment there. He'd tried. He'd almost succeeded, but almost wasn't enough. The leader checked his watch. 5 minutes. Still no vehicle. They're playing us. Maybe we need to show them we're serious, the second gunman suggested, his voice eager with barely suppressed violence. Execute one hostage. Send a message. No! The word burst from Lydia before she could stop it, raw and desperate. The second gunman turned toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Volunteer? There's another way, Lydia said quickly, her mind racing through every negotiation tactic she'd ever learned. They need time to arrange a vehicle. That's not stalling, that's logistics. But if you kill someone, you lose all leverage. You become cop killers instead of hostage takers. Every officer out there will be authorized to shoot on sight. Listen to her, Evan added from across the room. She's right. You kill anyone, this becomes a completely different situation. The leader's jaw clenched. 4 minutes. If there's no vehicle in 4 minutes, we're making a statement. The megaphone voice returned, carrying new urgency. We're working on your request, but we need assurances. Release the child and mother, and we'll... A gunshot shattered the air. For one horrible moment, Lydia thought someone had been killed. Then she saw the second gunman had fired into the ceiling again, his patience finally snapping. No more talking! He screamed toward the window. No more delays. Vehicle in 3 minutes or people start dying. You're panicking, Evan called out, his voice cutting through the hysteria with unexpected force. And panic gets people killed. You need to breathe. You need to think. I need you to shut up. The second gunman wheeled toward Evan, weapon raised, finger tightening on the trigger. Everything happened at once. Marcus, still standing near Evan, moved, not toward the other hostages, but stepping partially between his companion and Evan. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but it spoke volumes. The leader saw it, registered the betrayal in Marcus's positioning, and his face went cold. Lydia, watching all of this unfold, made a choice that 2 hours ago would have been unthinkable. She pushed herself up and forward, grabbing the second gunman's ankle in both hands and pulling with all her strength. The gunman stumbled, his shot going wide, the bullet punching through a light fixture and raining glass down on them all. Then Evan was moving, faster than seemed possible for a man who'd been struck in the head, his body propelling forward in a tackle that took the second gunman completely off his feet. They hit the floor hard, the weapon skittering away across the tile. Evan's fist connected with the gunman's jaw once, twice, putting him down and keeping him down with strikes that spoke of training far beyond civilian self-defense. The leader swung his weapon toward Evan, but Marcus was there, his own gun pressed against his leader's temple. Don't, Marcus said, his voice shaking but determined. It's over. Let them go. The cafe held its breath. Lydia watched from the floor as the leader's face cycled through rage, betrayal, and finally calculation. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, his only ally unconscious, his youngest member turned against him. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his weapon. Smart choice, Evan said, standing and kicking the second gunman's weapon away before retrieving the leader's. He moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the weapons and securing them near the counter where neither gunman could reach them. Marcus kept his gun trained on the leader, his whole body trembling with the enormity of what he'd just done. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Tell it to the judge," the leader said bitterly. "You just threw your life away, kid." "No," Evan said quietly, moving to Marcus's side. "He just saved it. Yours too, whether you're smart enough to see it or not." The megaphone voice returned, authoritative now. "We're coming in. All weapons on the ground. All individuals on their knees, hands on heads. Anyone holding a weapon when we breach will be shot." Marcus immediately dropped his gun, sinking to his knees with his hands laced behind his head. The leader followed suit more slowly, his expression murderous but his actions compliant. Evan stepped back, his hands raised high, positioning himself near Lydia as tactical teams poured through both entrances in a coordinated breach that spoke of extensive training. "Hands! Let me see your hands! On the ground! Now! Clear left! Clear right!" The cafe filled with armed officers, weapons trained on every person until they could identify hostage from hostage taker. Lydia found herself face down again, hands on her head, until someone confirmed her status and helped her up with unexpected gentleness. "You're safe now, ma'am. Medical is standing by outside." But Lydia wasn't looking at the officer helping her. She was looking at Evan, who was being attended by paramedics, blood still streaming from the gash above his eye. He met her gaze across the chaos, and something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. The mother and child were being escorted out, the little boy turning back to wave at Evan with the resilience of childhood. The elderly couple clutched each other as they were led to safety. One by one, the hostages were evacuated, assessed, wrapped in blankets despite the warm morning. Lydia let herself be guided outside into a world transformed by emergency vehicles and media crews. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Someone tried to drape a shock blanket over her shoulders, but she shrugged it off, her eyes scanning the crowd for Evan. She found him sitting in the back of an ambulance, a paramedic cleaning the wound on his forehead while another checked his pupils for concussion. He looked exhausted, battered, and somehow more whole than anyone she'd ever met. Lydia walked toward him on unsteady legs, her throat still aching, her hands still trembling. She should say something profound, something that acknowledged what he'd done, what they'd survived. But when she opened her mouth, only 3 words emerged. "You were military." Evan looked up, wincing as the paramedic applied antiseptic to his wound. "Marine Corps, 8 years, 2 deployments. Got out when my wife got sick, stayed out to raise Sophie alone." The pieces clicked into place. His tactical awareness, his calm under pressure, his ability to read situations and people with practiced precision. The worn jacket and work boots weren't poverty, they were priorities. The calloused hands weren't ignorance, they were capability. She'd looked at him and seen nothing worth her time. He'd looked at her and seen someone worth dying for. "I was wrong," Lydia said, the words costing more than she'd thought possible. "About you. About everything." "Yes," Evan agreed simply. "You were." He should have said more, should have softened it or accepted her apology gracefully. Instead, he just held her gaze, unflinching, and let the truth stand unadorned. "Sir, we need to get you to the hospital," the paramedic said. "That's going to need stitches, and you definitely have a concussion." "I need to call my daughter first," Evan said. "She'll be getting out of school soon, and if she sees this on the news before I talk to her—" "Use my phone," Lydia heard herself offer, pulling her cell from her pocket. Her hands were shaking too badly to dial, so she thrust it toward him. "Please." Evan took it, their fingers brushing, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he stepped down from the ambulance with the paramedic's reluctant permission and walked a few feet away for privacy. Lydia watched him, this man who'd saved her life, mocked her cruelty, and refused to let her die even when she deserved it. She heard the warmth flood his voice when his daughter answered, heard him reassuring her that he was fine, that everything was okay, that he'd be home for dinner just like always. She heard what unconditional love sounded like, and it broke something in her chest that had been sealed for 2 years. When he returned her phone, his eyes held a question. What happens now? Lydia didn't have an answer. Didn't know how to reconcile the woman she'd become with the woman she'd almost died as. Didn't know if people like her, people who'd turned themselves into weapons against a world that hurt them, could ever really change. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. "I want to understand," she said quietly, "how you did that, how you stayed calm, how you reached that boy, how you knew exactly what to do. I want to understand how someone becomes that instead of—" She gestured vaguely at herself, at the armor she'd worn for so long it had fused to her skin. Evan studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's going to take more than coffee." "I have time," Lydia said, "however long it takes." "Oh, they're loading me into the ambulance now," Evan said as the paramedics approached with renewed purpose. "But when they let me out, maybe we try this again. No testing, no games, just two people trying to understand each other." "I'd like that," Lydia whispered. She watched the ambulance pull away, carrying Evan toward stitches and scans and the mundane aftermath of extraordinary violence. Around her, the crime scene continued its orchestrated chaos. Officers taking statements, evidence teams photographing every angle, reporters reconstructing narrative from fragments. Detective Sarah Chen approached, notebook in hand, ready to begin the lengthy process of official testimony. "Ms. Crow, I'm going to need your full statement about what happened inside." Lydia nodded, preparing herself for hours of questions and reliving trauma. But as she followed the detective toward the mobile command center, she found herself thinking not about the guns or the fear or how close she'd come to death. She thought about Evan's eyes when he'd offered himself in her place, about his voice calming a terrified child, about his hands, those calloused working hands she'd mocked, disarming violence with the same practiced care he probably used to repair broken things. About how completely wrong she'd been about strength and power and what actually mattered when everything else fell away. The worst first meeting of her life had just saved it. And somewhere in the wreckage of her certainty, Lydia Crow began the painful, necessary work of building something new. The statement took 4 hours. Detective Chen was thorough, professional, and relentless in her pursuit of every detail. Lydia sat in the mobile command center, her voice growing hoarse as she recounted the morning's events with the precision her business training demanded. She described the gunmen's positioning, their coordination, the way the young one, Marcus, had shown hesitation from the beginning. She described Evan's intervention with clinical accuracy, though something in her chest tightened when she reached the part where he'd offered himself in her place. "And you're certain he said, 'Take me instead'?" Chen asked, her pen poised over her notebook. "Yes. Even though you'd spent the previous 20 minutes, by your own admission, insulting him?" Lydia met the detective's eyes. "Especially because of that." Chen made a note, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Miller's military background is going to be relevant to the investigation. The way he handled the situation shows specialized training that goes beyond civilian self-defense." "He was protecting people," Lydia said, surprised by the defensive edge in her voice. "He wasn't escalating, he was de-escalating. Everything he did was to prevent bloodshed." "I agree," Chen replied, "but the DA's office will want to understand his actions in context. Force continuum, proportional response, all the legal framework that determines whether his intervention was justified use of force or something else." "Something else?" "He saved lives. Multiple lives." "How is that in question?" Chen closed her notebook and leaned back. "Ms. Crow, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen hostage situations go sideways in 100 different ways. What Mr. Miller did in there, the tactical awareness, the threat assessment, the controlled application of force, that's not normal civilian behavior. That's advanced training under extreme stress. The system needs to verify that his actions were defensive rather than aggressive." Lydia felt anger spike through her exhaustion. "You're telling me the man who stopped a child from being shot might face charges?" "I'm telling you the system has protocols," Chen said evenly. "But between you and me, Mr. Miller's getting a commendation, not charges. I just need to document everything correctly so the DA can make that determination official." The anger receded slightly, replaced by weariness that went bone deep. Lydia had been running on adrenaline for hours, and the crash was approaching fast. Her hands still trembled when she wasn't concentrating on keeping them still. Her throat ached with every swallow. And beneath it all, a growing awareness of how fragile everything she'd built actually was. Chen noticed her pallor. "We're almost done. Just a few more questions about the timeline after the breach." They finished 20 minutes later. Chen handed Lydia her card with instructions to call if she remembered anything else, then released her into the late afternoon chaos. The media presence had grown exponentially. Satellite trucks lined the street, reporters doing stand-ups with the cafe's shattered facade as backdrop, helicopters circling overhead capturing aerial footage. Lydia pushed through the crowd with her head down, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes. Someone recognized her, and the questions grew more specific, more targeted. "Ms. Crow, is it true you were held at gunpoint? Ms. Crow, what was going through your mind? Ms. Crow, can you comment on the hero who saved you?" Hero. The word stuck in her mind as she finally broke free and reached her car, parked 3 blocks away in blissful anonymity. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands gripping the leather until her knuckles went white, and tried to process what the detective had called Evan. Hero implied something exceptional, someone who'd risen above normal human behavior to do something extraordinary. But watching Evan in that cafe, Lydia hadn't seen exception. She'd seen something that looked like fundamental nature, the way some people were simply wired to protect rather than preserve themselves, to act rather than calculate, to choose courage when survival demanded retreat. She'd built her entire life around self-preservation, had turned herself into someone impervious to threat because the alternative was vulnerability. And in a single morning, Evan Miller had shown her that true strength looked nothing like what she'd been pursuing. The drive home passed in a blur. Her penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan, all glass and steel and carefully curated art that spoke of success and taste and absolute control. She walked through the door and felt nothing but emptiness. The space was beautiful, expensive, perfect. It was also utterly devoid of warmth, of life, of anything that suggested actual human habitation rather than magazine-spread staging. Lydia poured herself 3 fingers of scotch, expensive single malt that she didn't taste, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the sun descend toward the lake's horizon. Her phone buzzed constantly. Claire calling repeatedly, her assistant forwarding urgent messages, news alerts about the hostage situation, social media notifications that she'd somehow become part of the story. She ignored all of it except one text from her sister. "Thank God you're alive. I saw the news. Call me when you can." Lydia stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to find words that could encompass what she'd experienced. Finally, she typed simply, "I'm okay. I'll call tomorrow. Love you." The response came immediately. "Love you too. So much." Lydia set the phone down and returned to the window. Somewhere across the city, Evan was probably home by now, probably sitting at dinner with his daughter, probably choosing not to terrify her with the full details of how close he'd come to dying, probably being the father he'd promised to be, present and whole and devoted. The contrast to her own isolation felt suddenly unbearable. Her phone rang, and this time she answered without checking the caller ID. "Yes? Ms. Crow? This is Amanda Ross from Chicago Metropolitan Hospital. I'm calling about Evan Miller." Lydia's heart seized. "Is he okay? Did something happen?" "He's fine," the nurse assured her quickly. "He's been treated and released, but he left something for you at the nurse's station. He said you'd probably call or come by, and he wanted you to have it." "What is it?" "A note and an address. He said you'd understand." Lydia closed her eyes, something unfamiliar moving through her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the desperate need to see proof that the morning's events had actually happened, that Evan was real and whole and still somehow willing to give her another chance. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said. She made it in 20, driving too fast through evening traffic, her exhaustion temporarily overridden by urgency. The hospital's visitor parking was surprisingly empty for a Tuesday evening. Lydia found her way to the emergency department, located the nurse's station, and identified herself to a tired-looking nurse who matched the voice from the phone. "Oh yes, Mr. Miller left this for you." Amanda retrieved a sealed envelope from a drawer. "He was very specific that it should only go to you personally." Lydia took the envelope with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The paper was standard hospital stationery, but Evan's handwriting on the front was surprisingly elegant. her name written with careful precision that spoke of practice and attention. She waited until she reached her car to open it. Inside was a single sheet with an address in a neighborhood she recognized as middle-income residential, about 20 minutes north. Below the address, Evan had written, "If you meant what you said about wanting to understand, come by tomorrow around 6. Sophie will want to meet the woman from the news, and I make a decent lasagna. No pressure, no expectations, just dinner and conversation. Your choice entirely. Evan." Lydia read it 3 times, searching for hidden meaning or subtle manipulation. But the invitation was exactly what it appeared to be: genuine, uncomplicated, offering connection without demand. Everything her world of power plays and strategic relationships was not. She should decline, should recognize this for what it was: a distraction from her actual life, a temporary emotional response to shared trauma that would fade once the adrenaline fully receded. Tomorrow, she'd wake up and return to being Lydia Crow, CEO and power broker, and this entire episode would become an anecdote she'd eventually stop thinking about. Except she knew, sitting in her car holding Evan's note, that she was lying to herself, that something fundamental had shifted in that cafe, and pretending otherwise was just another form of armor. She drove home, set an alarm for 5:30 the next evening, and tried to sleep. The nightmares came immediately, hands around her throat, guns to her temple, the terrible certainty of approaching death. She woke gasping at 2 a.m., then again at 4, finally giving up on rest and making coffee while the city still slept around her. By 5:30 the next evening, Lydia had changed outfits 4 times, settling finally on designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that split the difference between casual and her usual armor of suits. She'd never been this uncertain about a social engagement, never second-guessed herself with such intensity. The woman who walked into hostile boardrooms without breaking stride couldn't figure out what to bring to a dinner with a man and his 7-year-old daughter. She settled on wine, good wine but not ostentatiously expensive, and a children's book about paleontology that the bookstore clerk had recommended for Sophie's age group. Safe choices, thoughtful without being overwhelming. The drive to Evan's address took her into a neighborhood of older homes with actual yards, trees lining quiet streets, basketball hoops in driveways. It was aggressively normal in a way that made Lydia's penthouse feel even more artificial by comparison. She found the house easily, a modest 2-story with blue siding and white trim, well-maintained but clearly lived in rather than showcased. Lydia sat in her car for 3 full minutes, gathering courage, before finally walking up the path to the front door. She could hear music inside, something with a bright melody that suggested children's programming. The doorbell played a cheerful chime that seemed impossibly innocent after yesterday's violence. The door opened, and Sophie Miller stood there, all wild dark curls and gap-toothed smile, wearing a t-shirt with a T-Rex that proclaimed fossil fuel. "You're the lady from the news," Sophie announced with the directness of childhood. "Dad said you were coming for dinner. Are you really a CEO?" "Sophie, let her come inside first before the interrogation," Evan's voice called from deeper in the house. He appeared a moment later, wearing jeans and a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, a dish towel over one shoulder. The gash above his eye had been neatly stitched, and the bruising had darkened to spectacular purple and yellow, but his smile was genuine. "Sorry, she's been preparing questions all day." "It's fine," Lydia said, stepping inside and offering Sophie the book. "I heard you like dinosaurs." Sophie's eyes went wide. "This is the new Backer book. Dad said we couldn't afford it yet." She clutched it to her chest with reverence. "Thank you. Can I show you my fossil collection?" After dinner, Evan intervened gently. "Go wash your hands, kiddo." Sophie bounded away with the book, leaving Lydia alone with Evan in a living room that was warm, cluttered, and completely unlike anywhere she'd ever been. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. Photographs lined the mantel. Sophie at various ages, Evan in uniform looking impossibly young, a beautiful woman with Sophie's curls who had to be Evan's late wife. "Your home is lovely," Lydia said, meaning it. "It's chaotic," Evan corrected with a laugh. "But it's ours. Come on, lasagna is almost ready." The dinner was simple, delicious, and unlike any meal Lydia had experienced in years. Sophie dominated the conversation with stories about school, her fossil collection, and elaborate theories about what caused the dinosaur extinction. Evan listened with patient attention, asking thoughtful questions, occasionally correcting Sophie's more creative scientific liberties with gentle humor. Lydia watched them, fascinated by the easy affection between father and daughter. The way Evan's entire being softened around Sophie. The way Sophie looked to him for approval, security, unconditional acceptance. This was what love looked like when it wasn't transactional, when it didn't require performance or achievement, or constant proof of worthiness. "So, Ms. Crow," Sophie said, tackling her second helping of lasagna with impressive determination, "Dad says you run a company that helps other companies. What does that mean?" Lydia glanced at Evan, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Well, I find companies that are struggling and help them work better. Sometimes that means changing how they do things. Sometimes it means helping them focus on what they're best at." "And you're really good at it?" "Yes," Lydia said, allowing herself some pride. "I'm very good at it." "Dad's really good at fixing things," Sophie announced. "Last week he fixed Mrs. Patterson's water heater, and she cried because she thought she'd have to move out of her apartment. Dad didn't even charge her." Evan's expression carried mild embarrassment. "Sophie, that's not—" "It's true," Sophie insisted. "You said helping people matters more than money sometimes." Lydia felt something shift in her understanding of the man across the table. "You do pro bono work?" "Not exactly," Evan said. There are people who need help and can't afford market rates. So I charge what they can handle, or sometimes nothing if they're really struggling. It evens out." "That's not good business practice," Lydia said automatically, then immediately regretted the corporate response. But Evan just smiled. "No, it's not. But it's good humanity practice." The words landed with unexpected weight. Lydia had spent 2 years building a business empire on ruthless efficiency, on extracting maximum value from every transaction. The idea of deliberately choosing less profit for someone else's benefit was so foreign to her current operating system that she struggled to process it. "Can I be excused?" Sophie asked. "I want to get my fossil collection." "Clear your plate first," Evan instructed. Sophie complied with practiced ease, rinsing her dish and loading it into the dishwasher before racing upstairs with thundering footsteps. Evan turned his attention fully to Lydia, his expression gentle but direct. "You look exhausted." "I didn't sleep well," Lydia admitted. "Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that cafe." "That's normal. Adrenaline hangover plus trauma processing. It'll get better, but it takes time." "How do you know?" Then remembering his military background, "Never mind. Stupid question." "Not stupid," Evan said. "But yeah, I've been through it. After my first deployment, I couldn't sleep for weeks without seeing things I wanted to forget. Eventually, you learn to carry it differently." Lydia traced the rim of her wine glass. "How?" "Therapy helped. Time helped. Sophie helped most of all. Having someone who needed me to be functional pushed me to actually deal with the trauma instead of just burying it." "I don't have that," Lydia said quietly. "Someone who needs me functional. My company needs me sharp, but that's different." Evan leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unsettling gray-blue eyes. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business." "Yes." "What happened to make you believe that armor was safer than connection?" The question bypassed every defense she'd prepared. Lydia opened her mouth to deliver some practiced deflection, then stopped. Evan had saved her life, had invited her into his home, his daughter's presence, the intimate space of his actual existence. He'd earned honesty, even if giving it terrified her. "My ex-husband," she said finally. "Marcus. We met at Harvard Business School. He was brilliant, ambitious, came from old Connecticut money. Everyone said we were the perfect power couple. I believed it too, for a while." She paused, surprised by how much it still hurt. "We built the original version of my company together. Equal partners, or so I thought. Then 3 years in, I came home early from a conference and found him in our bed with his assistant. 23 years old, blonde, exactly the cliché you'd expect." Evan's expression darkened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "That wasn't even the worst part," Lydia said, the words coming faster now. "The worst part was discovering that he'd been systematically undermining me with our investors, positioning himself as the real talent and me as the face. He'd made deals behind my back, frozen me out of decisions, Set up a whole parallel structure designed to push me out of my own company. What did you do? Burned it down, Lydia said flatly. The whole company. I had enough leverage with key investors to force a dissolution rather than let him take it. We both lost everything we'd built, but at least he didn't win. And then you started over. And then I started over, this time without partners, without trust, without any vulnerability that could be exploited. I built Crow Capital to be mine completely, to operate according to my rules alone. No one gets close enough to betray me because no one gets close at all. Evan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried understanding rather than judgment. That's a high price to pay for safety. It was the only price I could afford, Lydia replied. Vulnerability almost destroyed me. I won't risk it again. But you came here tonight. The observation hung between them, undeniable. Lydia had come, had accepted his invitation despite every principle she'd built her life around, had walked into his home, met his daughter, allowed herself to be seen in a context where her armor didn't fit. I don't know why I came, she admitted. I should have declined, should have sent a polite thank you note and moved on with my life. But I couldn't stop thinking about what you said in the cafe, about me being so busy winning that I'd lost everything that mattered. I was harsh, Evan said. You'd just been through trauma. I shouldn't have. You were right, Lydia interrupted. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about. You were completely right, and I hated it, and I needed to understand how someone becomes what you are instead of what I've become. Sophie's footsteps thundered back down the stairs before Evan could respond. She appeared carrying a tackle box that she set on the table with ceremonial importance. This is my collection, she announced, opening it to reveal dozens of small fossils, each carefully labeled with masking tape and marker. Dad helps me find them. We go to this quarry every month and dig. Lydia examined the collection with genuine interest. The fossils were modest, trilobites, brachiopods, bits of petrified wood, but Sophie's enthusiasm transformed them into treasures. She explained each one's significance with the seriousness of a museum curator, mixing accurate paleontological information with creative speculation about the creatures' lives. This one's my favorite, Sophie said, holding up a small ammonite. Dad found it on my birthday last year. He says it's like a time machine because I'm holding something that was alive millions of years ago. That's a beautiful way to think about it, Lydia said, touched by the poetry of Evan's explanation. Dad's really good with words, Sophie said matter-of-factly. He reads me stories every night, and he does all the different voices. Sometimes I fall asleep, and he keeps reading anyway because he likes the stories too. Evan cleared his throat, clearly embarrassed by his daughter's admiration. Okay, kiddo, I think Miss Crow has seen enough fossils for one evening. But I haven't shown her the crinoid yet. Next time, Evan promised. Go get ready for bed. Teeth, pajamas, the whole routine. Sophie gathered her collection with careful reverence, then surprised Lydia by stepping close and wrapping small arms around her waist in a brief, fierce hug. I'm glad Dad met you, Sophie whispered. Even if it was scary. He needs more friends. Then she was gone, racing upstairs again, leaving Lydia standing frozen by the simple gift of a child's acceptance. Evan started clearing the table, and Lydia moved to help automatically. They worked in comfortable silence, loading the dishwasher, wiping counters, the domestic choreography of shared space. It felt impossibly normal after yesterday's violence, impossibly intimate after years of keeping everyone at careful distance. She's wonderful, Lydia said when they finished. You've done an amazing job with her. She makes it easy, Evan replied. She's got her mother's warmth, her curiosity, her fundamental kindness. I just try not to mess that up too badly. You're too modest. I'm realistic, Evan corrected gently. Single parenting is hard. Some days I'm barely keeping it together, but Sophie deserves my best effort, so that's what she gets. Lydia thought about her own life, the success, the wealth, the power she'd accumulated. None of it required her best effort anymore. She'd mastered the game so completely that most days she operated on autopilot, leveraging established patterns and relationships to maintain her empire with minimal actual engagement. I envy you, she said quietly. Evan looked genuinely surprised. Why? Because you have something worth giving your best effort to. Because your life has meaning beyond accumulation and victory. Because you've built something real instead of just building walls. You could build something real too, Evan said. You're brilliant, driven, capable of incredible things. You just have to decide what you actually want those things to be. I don't know anymore, Lydia admitted. For 2 years, I've known exactly what I wanted: power, security, control. But yesterday, when I thought I was going to die, none of that mattered. All I could think was how empty my life would look from the outside, how there'd be obituaries about my professional accomplishments, but nothing about who I actually was as a person. Evan moved closer, his presence solid and steady. So change it. I don't know how. Same way you built your company, Evan said simply. One decision at a time. One choice that prioritizes connection over control, vulnerability over victory, humanity over power. That's terrifying. Yeah, Evan agreed. Real courage usually is. They stood there in his kitchen, inches apart, and Lydia felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, but opening, the first real breath after years of holding herself rigid against hurt. I want to try, she whispered. I don't know if I can actually change, if I can unlearn everything I've built myself into, but I want to try. Evan's hand came up slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, and settled gently on her shoulder. The same gesture he'd used in the cafe to ground her during panic, but transformed now into something warmer. Comfort instead of just tactical support. Then try, he said. No pressure, no timeline, no requirements. Just try and see what happens. Sophie called from upstairs, ready for her bedtime story, and the moment passed. But something had shifted between them, some foundation laid for whatever might come next. Lydia left an hour later, after listening to Evan read Sophie 3 chapters of a book about dinosaur detectives, his voice shifting seamlessly between characters with practiced ease. She drove home through quiet streets, her mind full of fossils and lasagna and the particular quality of light in Evan's kitchen. Her penthouse felt even emptier than before, but for the first time, Lydia allowed herself to feel the emptiness rather than filling it with work or anger or carefully maintained emotional distance. She stood at her windows overlooking the lake and made herself a promise. Tomorrow, she would start trying. Start making different choices, building different patterns, allowing space for something beyond the armor she'd worn for so long. She didn't know if transformation was actually possible for someone like her. Didn't know if you could fundamentally change who you'd become, or if certain damage was simply permanent. But Evan had saved her life. And in return, maybe she could try to save herself. The trying started small, almost invisible at first. Wednesday morning, Lydia arrived at her office and paused at her assistant's desk instead of walking past with barely a nod. Jennifer looked up, clearly startled by the deviation from routine. Good morning, Jennifer. How's your mother doing? You mentioned she had surgery last week. Jennifer's eyes widened. She's doing much better, thank you. The doctors say recovery is going well. That's good to hear. If you need any additional time off to help with her care, just let me know. Lydia continued to her office, leaving Jennifer staring after her with visible confusion. The exchange had taken maybe 30 seconds, cost nothing, and yet Lydia felt oddly off balance. She'd worked with Jennifer for 18 months and had never once asked about her personal life. The information about her mother's surgery had been mentioned in a scheduling email Lydia had skimmed without really absorbing. But Evan would have asked. Evan would have noticed someone struggling and offered help without calculating the return on investment. The thought followed Lydia through her morning meetings, coloring her interactions in unfamiliar ways. During the 9 a.m. strategy session, she caught herself actually listening when her junior analyst presented concerns about a potential acquisition instead of dismissing them as overcautious hedging. The concerns were valid. She could see that once she stopped viewing every question as a challenge to her authority. You're right, she said, and watched the analyst's face cycle through shock and cautious hope. The due diligence timeline is too aggressive. Push it back 2 weeks and get me a deeper analysis of their liabilities. Better to move slowly than clean up a mess later. Her senior partners exchanged glances. Lydia Crow did not admit error. Lydia Crow did not accept delays. Lydia Crow certainly didn't validate junior analysts who questioned her judgment. But that version of Lydia Crow had nearly died in a cafe, and maybe some things needed to die so others could live. By Thursday, word had spread through the office that something had changed. Lydia could feel it in the way people interacted with her, cautious, uncertain, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She'd built a culture of fear and efficiency, and now her attempts at basic humanity were being received as potential traps. The realization stung more than she'd expected. Thursday evening, her phone rang with Evan's number. Her heart did something complicated when she saw his name on the screen. "Hey," his voice came through warm and slightly tired. "Sophie wanted me to call. She has a question for you." There was rustling, then Sophie's excited voice. "Ms. Crow, we're going to the quarry on Saturday to dig for fossils. Dad says I can invite a friend. Do you want to come?" Lydia opened her mouth to decline automatically. Weekends were for work, for maintaining the edge that kept her empire running. Then she stopped, remembering her promise to try. "I'd love to," she heard herself say. "What should I bring?" Sophie launched into an enthusiastic explanation of proper fossil hunting equipment, while Lydia took notes on the back of a quarterly report. Sturdy shoes, sunscreen, water bottle, gloves if she had them. The mundane details of an activity completely outside her normal existence. When Evan came back on the line, his voice carried quiet approval. "You don't have to do this, you know, if you're busy." "I want to," Lydia interrupted. "Unless I'm intruding on your time with Sophie." "You're not intruding. Sophie doesn't invite people lightly. She likes you." "I like her too," Lydia said, surprised by how much she meant it. "She's remarkable." "She is," Evan agreed. "We'll pick you up at 8 on Saturday. Bring old clothes you don't mind getting dirty." After they hung up, Lydia sat at her desk looking at her calendar. Saturday had been blocked for reviewing acquisition targets and preparing for Monday's board presentation. She moved the work to Sunday, feeling both guilty and strangely liberated by the choice. Friday brought the real test. Marcus Webb appeared in her waiting room at 2 p.m., unscheduled and unexpected. Her ex-husband looked exactly as she remembered, polished, confident, expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The sight of him sent ice through her veins, every protective instinct screaming at her to have security remove him immediately. Instead, she told Jennifer to send him in. Marcus walked into her office with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never truly faced consequences. He settled into the chair across from her desk without invitation, his smile sharp and knowing. "Lydia, you look well. I saw the news about the hostage situation. Must have been terrifying." "What do you want, Marcus?" She kept her voice level, professional, giving him nothing. "I wanted to see how you were doing. We may have ended badly, but I still care about your well-being." The lie was so transparent it would have been laughable if it wasn't so insulting. "You wanted to see if I was vulnerable, if the trauma made me weak enough to manipulate." "The answer is no." Marcus's smile never wavered. "Always so suspicious. I'm here with a genuine business proposal. I've been watching Crow Capital's growth. You've built something impressive. I'm putting together a consortium for a major infrastructure play, and I think your fund would be a perfect partner." "Not interested." "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to," Lydia said, standing to signal the conversation was over. "I know how you operate, Marcus. You don't propose partnerships. You engineer hostile takeovers. You're here because you see an opportunity to undermine me, just like you did before. And I'm telling you it's not going to work." Marcus stood as well, his expression hardening into something uglier. "You're making a mistake. This consortium is happening with or without you. Better to be on the inside than watching from outside." "I'll take my chances on the outside. Jennifer will show you out." She expected anger, maybe threats. Instead, Marcus studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Something's different about you," he said slowly. "You're not as sharp, not as hungry. That hostage situation rattled you more than you're admitting." "The hostage situation taught me what actually matters," Lydia replied. "And business dealings with people like you aren't on that list. Goodbye, Marcus." He left, but his words lingered. Not as sharp, not as hungry. Was that what choosing humanity over ruthlessness looked like from the outside? Weakness rather than evolution? The doubt followed her through Friday evening and into Saturday morning. She stood in her closet at 7 a.m., staring at clothes that cost more than some cars, trying to find something appropriate for digging in dirt. She finally settled on old yoga pants she'd bought years ago and never worn, a faded Northwestern t-shirt from her MBA days, and sneakers that had never touched anything rougher than a treadmill. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. No armor, no designer labels, nothing that screamed power and success. Just a woman in comfortable clothes, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, face free of the makeup that usually served as war paint. Evan's truck pulled up at exactly 8. It was old, practical, showing the same honest wear as his work clothes. Sophie bounced in the back seat, waving enthusiastically when she spotted Lydia. "You came, and you dressed right. Dad said you might wear fancy clothes because you didn't know better, but I told him you were smart enough to figure it out." Lydia climbed into the passenger seat, touched by Sophie's faith in her intelligence. "I did some research. Apparently fossil hunting is dirty work." "The best kind," Sophie proclaimed. "You find the coolest stuff in the dirt." The drive took 40 minutes, leading them northwest into countryside that Lydia rarely saw. Evan drove with easy competence, one hand on the wheel, occasionally pointing out landmarks to Sophie. They had the comfortable rhythm of people who'd traveled this route many times, who knew each other's patterns and preferences without needing to discuss them. Lydia found herself studying Evan's profile when he wasn't looking. The bruising from the cafe had faded to yellow-green, the stitches still visible but healing cleanly. He looked rested, peaceful, completely unlike the tactical warrior who'd disarmed gunmen days ago. "You're staring," Evan said without looking away from the road, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Sorry, I'm just trying to reconcile different versions of you. The man who reads bedtime stories versus the Marine who took down armed hostage takers." "They're the same person," Evan replied. "The Marine training gave me tools. Sophie gives me purpose. Neither one erases the other. They just exist together." "How do you balance them?" "I don't, really. I just try to use the right tool for the situation. Sometimes that means knowing how to disarm a threat. Sometimes it means knowing how to calm a scared kid. The trick is having enough self-awareness to recognize which one's needed." They arrived at the quarry to find it mostly empty. Just a few other weekend fossil hunters scattered across the exposed limestone. Sophie exploded from the truck with barely contained enthusiasm, grabbing her equipment and racing toward her favorite digging spot. "Stay where I can see you," Evan called after her, then turned to Lydia with an apologetic smile. She gets excited. "Come on, I'll show you the basics." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of physical labor and surprising peace. Evan taught Lydia how to read the limestone layers, where to look for the telltale signs of fossilized remains, how to carefully extract specimens without damaging them. She found her first fossil, a small brachiopod, after 90 minutes of patient searching, and the rush of discovery was unexpectedly profound. "I found something millions of years old," she said, cradling the fossil in her palm with reverence. "You did," Evan confirmed, his expression warm with shared joy. "That creature was alive when this whole area was underwater. You're holding proof of a completely different world." Sophie appeared, her collection bag already bulging with finds, and examined Lydia's discovery with the seriousness of a professional appraiser. "That's a really good one for your first try," she declared. "You have good eyes. Dad, can we show her the crinoid bed?" They moved to a different section of the quarry, and Lydia found herself actually enjoying the physical work. Her hands grew dirty, her back started to ache from crouching. Sweat dampened her shirt despite the cool October air. None of it felt like hardship. It felt like being present in her body in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "You're smiling," Evan observed during a water break. "Really smiling, not the professional mask you wear in your office." "How do you know about my professional mask?" "I looked you up," Evan admitted. "There are videos of you at industry conferences, interviews about your company. You're impressive, intimidating, and completely different from the woman sitting here covered in limestone dust looking happy." Lydia considered this. "The woman in those videos is who I built myself to be. The woman here is, I don't know, someone I used to be maybe, before I decided vulnerability was too dangerous." "Which one's real?" "Both? Neither?" Lydia set down her water bottle and met his eyes. "I'm starting to think I've been asking the wrong question. It's not about which version is real, it's about which version I want to be. And what do you want?" The question was deceptively simple, devastatingly complex. Lydia looked out at the quarry, at Sophie carefully extracting a fossil with patient concentration, at Evan watching her with those steady gray-blue eyes that saw too much. "I want to be someone who can do both," she said finally. "Someone strong enough to succeed in boardrooms but human enough to dig for fossils on Saturday mornings. Someone who protects themselves without becoming impenetrable." "That's possible," Evan said. "It's hard, but it's possible." "How do you know?" "Because I do it every day. The Marine in me knows how to hurt people efficiently. The father in me knows how to heal them gently. I choose which one leads based on what the situation needs. You can do the same thing. Let the CEO handle business, but don't let her be the only part of you that gets to exist." They worked in comfortable silence for another hour before Sophie declared she was hungry enough to eat a dinosaur. They packed up their finds, brushed off the worst of the limestone dust, and drove to a diner that specialized in exactly the kind of comfort food Lydia never allowed herself to eat. Sophie ordered pancakes with chocolate chips and whipped cream. Evan got a burger that barely fit on the plate. Lydia found herself asking for the same, abandoning her usual Caesar salad without dressing. "This is going to destroy my macros," she said, watching the server walk away with their order. "Good," Evan replied. "You could use some destruction of rigid systems." The food arrived massive and delicious, and Lydia ate until she was genuinely full, not calculating portions or tracking calories, just enjoying the experience. Sophie chattered about her fossil finds, planning where each one would go in her collection, already anticipating their next quarry trip. "Can Ms. Crow come again?" Sophie asked Evan. "She's really good at finding things." "That's up to Ms. Crow," Evan said, but his eyes held a question directed at Lydia. "I'd like that," Lydia said. "If you'll have me." "We'll have you," Sophie confirmed with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You're part of our team now." The declaration landed with unexpected weight. Part of their team. Part of something that wasn't transactional or strategic, that didn't require performance or achievement, just presence, participation, showing up, and trying. The drive back to the city felt too short. Lydia found herself wishing for more time in the truck's comfortable confines, listening to Sophie's stories and Evan's gentle corrections, watching the landscape blur past. Real life waited in Chicago, her office, her responsibilities, the empire that required constant vigilance. But she'd stolen a few hours for something else, and the world hadn't collapsed. Evan pulled up outside her building as the sun started its descent toward evening. Sophie hugged her goodbye with casual affection, making Lydia promise to show her office sometime and explain what CEOs actually did all day. Evan walked her to the lobby entrance, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for today," Lydia said. "I needed it more than I realized." "You're welcome. Though I should warn you, Sophie's going to want to adopt you permanently. She's already planning your education in paleontology." I could use some education," Lydia replied. "In a lot of things, apparently." Evan stepped closer, and Lydia's breath caught. "You're doing it, the trying. I can see it in how you interact with Sophie, how you approach the fossil hunting, even how you ordered that burger without calculating its impact on your nutrition plan. You're letting yourself be human instead of perfect." "It's terrifying," Lydia admitted. "Every instinct tells me I'm making myself vulnerable, opening pathways for hurt." "You are," Evan said simply. "That's what connection requires. But you're also opening pathways for joy, for meaning, for the kind of life that actually feels worth living." He was close enough now that Lydia could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could smell limestone dust and something essentially him. Her heart was doing complicated things in her chest, feelings she'd suppressed for 2 years suddenly demanding attention. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to let someone in without armor, without contingency plans, without guaranteed control over outcomes." "Nobody knows how to do it," Evan replied. "We just choose it anyway, and figure it out as we go." He was going to kiss her. Lydia could see the intention forming, could feel the magnetic pull between them. Part of her wanted it desperately. Part of her wanted to run. "I'm not ready," she said, the honesty costing her but feeling necessary. "I want to be, but I'm not there yet." Evan stepped back immediately, no pressure, no disappointment visible in his expression. "Then we wait until you are. No timeline, no requirements. Just whenever you're ready." "What if I'm never ready?" What if I'm too damaged to actually change? Then we'll figure that out too, Evan said. But I don't think you're too damaged. I think you're just scared, and that's okay. Being scared and choosing courage anyway is kind of the whole point. He left her there in the lobby, walking back to his truck where Sophie waited, and Lydia watched them drive away, feeling something uncurl in her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the first real breath after years of holding herself rigid. She went upstairs to her penthouse, stripped off her dusty clothes, and stood under the shower for 20 minutes, letting hot water wash away limestone and fear. When she emerged, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw something different. Not transformation, that would take longer, would require more than a single day of fossil hunting and honest conversation. But possibility. The first cracks in armor that had felt permanent. The beginning of believing that maybe, just maybe, she could become someone who had both strength and softness, who could protect herself without destroying her capacity for connection. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Lydia walked into her office prepared for the usual warfare, the constant assertion of dominance that kept Crow Capital functioning. But something had shifted in her approach. During the executive meeting, when her CFO challenged a decision about dividend allocation, Lydia actually considered his perspective instead of crushing the dissent. "You make a fair point about cash reserves," she said, and watched shock ripple through the room. "Let's table this discussion until we've run more scenarios. I want to see both options modeled completely before making a final call." Her general counsel almost dropped his coffee. Her CFO looked like he'd witnessed a miracle. "Are you feeling all right, Lydia?" her marketing director asked carefully. "This isn't like you." "No," Lydia agreed. "It's not. I'm trying something different. I'm trying to build a company where people's expertise actually gets heard instead of just serving as background noise for my predetermined decisions." The meeting continued with a different energy, tentative at first, then gaining momentum as people realized this wasn't a trap. Ideas emerged that Lydia would have dismissed weeks ago. Problems got solved collaboratively instead of by executive decree. It was messier, took longer, required her to actually listen instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. It was also significantly better. By Wednesday, her executive team had stopped treating every interaction like potential detonation of hidden explosives. By Friday, her assistant Jennifer brought her coffee without being asked and mentioned that people were talking about the change. "What are they saying?" Lydia asked. Jennifer hesitated, clearly weighing professional discretion against honesty. "That you seem more human, less terrifying. They're not sure if it's permanent or if you'll revert once whatever prompted this shift passes." "It's permanent," Lydia said with more certainty than she felt. "Or at least, I'm going to try to make it permanent. Can I ask what changed?" Lydia thought about the cafe, the gun to her temple, Evan's steady presence in the middle of nightmare. Thought about Sophie's fossil collection and Saturday mornings covered in limestone dust. Thought about the woman she'd been versus the woman she was trying to become. "I almost died," she said simply. "And when I thought my life was ending, I realized I'd been so focused on winning that I'd forgotten why winning mattered. So I'm trying to remember, trying to build something that would actually feel meaningful if it was all I had left." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Then, "For what it's worth, I think people are responding to it. The company feels different, better." The validation landed unexpectedly. Lydia had spent 2 years building Crow Capital through fear and excellence. The idea that humanity might actually improve performance instead of weakening it was foreign to everything she'd believed. But the numbers backed it up. By the end of the month, employee satisfaction scores had jumped 12%. Productivity was up. 2 analysts who'd been planning to leave accepted counteroffers when Lydia took the time to actually discuss their career goals instead of just throwing money at retention. Her empire wasn't crumbling. If anything, it was strengthening, built now on foundation more stable than fear. Friday evening, Evan texted, "Sophie wants to know if you're coming to her school's science fair next Thursday. She's presenting on fossil formation and considers you her consultant on the project." Lydia looked at her calendar. Thursday evening had been blocked for a networking event with potential investors, the kind of obligatory appearance that maintained her industry visibility. She canceled it and texted back, "I wouldn't miss it." The science fair was exactly what she'd expected, Elaborate displays, nervous children, parents with cameras, the particular chaos of elementary school events. Sophie's presentation was meticulous, complete with hand-drawn diagrams and actual fossil specimens borrowed from her personal collection. Lydia stood with Evan, watching Sophie explain sedimentary processes to a judge, her confidence and knowledge evident in every word. When the judge moved on, Sophie caught Lydia's eye and gave her a covert thumbs up. "She worked on this for weeks," Evan said quietly. "Wanted it to be perfect to impress you." "She didn't need to impress me," Lydia replied. "I was already impressed." "Tell her that. She needs to hear it from people she admires." When Sophie finished her presentation, Lydia made her way through the crowd and knelt to Sophie's level. "That was incredible," she said seriously. "Your research was thorough, your presentation was clear, and your passion for the subject was obvious. I learned things I didn't know, and I'm supposed to be the adult here." Sophie's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? You really learned something?" "Really, you're an excellent teacher." Sophie threw her arms around Lydia's neck in an impulsive hug, and Lydia found herself returning it without hesitation. This child, this brilliant, warm, completely open child, had somehow bypassed every defense Lydia possessed and taken up residence in a part of her heart she'd thought permanently closed. When Sophie released her and ran off to show her project to friends, Evan appeared at Lydia's side. "She loves you," he said. "You know that, right?" "I love her too," Lydia replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "She's extraordinary." "So are you," Evan said quietly. The woman who walked into that cafe would never have come to a school science fair, would never have let a 7-year-old hug her in public, would never have admitted to learning something from a child. "That woman was miserable," Lydia said. "She just didn't know it because she'd convinced herself that winning was the same as living." And now? Lydia watched Sophie across the gym, surrounded by friends and fossils, completely in her element. "Now, I'm starting to understand the difference." They left the science fair with Sophie riding high on the announcement that she'd won second place, chattering about how she'd improve her presentation for next year. Evan drove them to an ice cream shop to celebrate, and Lydia found herself sitting in a booth eating mint chocolate chip and listening to Sophie's animated breakdown of every judge's questions. This was happiness, she realized, not the sharp satisfaction of closing a deal or destroying a competitor, but this quiet joy of being present with people who cared about her without calculation, who accepted her presence as gift rather than transaction. "You're doing it again," Evan said, catching her staring. "Doing what?" "Smiling like you mean it." "I do mean it," Lydia said. "That's the scary part." When they dropped her off that night, Sophie made her promise to come to her next school event, and the next fossil hunt, and the next weekend movie night they had planned. Each promise felt like a small surrender of the control Lydia had clung to for years, and each one felt entirely worth it. In the elevator up to her penthouse, Lydia caught her reflection and barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked softer somehow, more accessible, the sharp edges worn down by weeks of choosing connection over conquest. She looked like someone worth knowing instead of someone worth fearing. And for the first time in 2 years, Lydia Crow thought that might actually be enough. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without setbacks. 2 weeks after the science fair, Lydia found herself in a hostile negotiation with a competitor trying to poach one of her key portfolio companies. Every instinct she'd honed over 2 years of ruthless business practice screamed at her to crush them, to deploy the full arsenal of legal threats and financial pressure that had made Crow Capital feared across the industry. Instead, she paused, took a breath, asked herself what Evan would do, not Evan the Marine, but Evan the father, the man who'd chosen empathy even with a gun to his head. She called the competitor's CEO directly, bypassing lawyers and intermediaries, and proposed a conversation. They met for coffee, ironically at a cafe 3 blocks from where the hostage situation had unfolded. Lydia walked in prepared for warfare and chose dialogue instead. "You want the company because you believe you can execute their vision better than I can," she said, setting down her cup. "So convince me. Show me your plan, your resources, your commitment. If you're genuinely better positioned to help them succeed, I'll step aside. But if this is just opportunistic poaching, I'll fight you with everything I have." The competitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, looked genuinely shocked. You're serious? Completely. I'm trying something new, prioritizing what's actually best for the companies I work with, rather than just protecting my territory. It's uncomfortable as hell, but I think it might be right. Patricia studied her for a long moment, then opened her laptop and walked Lydia through a genuinely impressive strategic plan. It was better than what Lydia had developed, more aligned with the company's core mission, backed by resources and partnerships that Crow Capital couldn't match. You're right, Lydia said when Patricia finished. You're better positioned for this. I'll withdraw my opposition to the acquisition. Just like that? Just like that. Though I'm going to recommend some contractual protections for the company's founders and employees. They deserve to benefit from this transition, not just be absorbed and discarded. They worked out terms over 2 hours of surprisingly collaborative negotiation. When they finished, Patricia extended her hand. I heard about what happened to you last month, the hostage situation. People said it might have broken you, made you vulnerable. It did make me vulnerable, Lydia agreed, but I'm learning that's not the same as weak. News of the deal spread quickly through Chicago's financial circles, and reactions were mixed. Some saw it as strategic brilliance, Lydia Crow positioning herself as reasonable and collaborative, expanding her influence through cooperation rather than conquest. Others saw weakness, blood in the water, evidence that the ruthless CEO who'd terrorized boardrooms had lost her edge. Marcus called within 24 hours. I heard about the Chen deal, he said without preamble when Lydia answered. You're slipping. The old Lydia would have buried Patricia for even attempting that acquisition. The old Lydia would have won the battle and lost something more important, Lydia replied. I'm trying to build differently now. You're trying to build soft, Marcus corrected, and soft doesn't survive in our world. I'm moving forward with that infrastructure consortium I mentioned. Several of your competitors have already joined. Last chance to get on board before you're left behind. Lydia pulled up the research her team had compiled on Marcus's consortium. The structure was brilliant, aggressive, and fundamentally predatory, designed to extract maximum profit from public infrastructure projects while shifting all risk onto taxpayers and municipal governments. I'm not interested in projects that hurt communities for shareholder benefit, she said. Find someone else. Communities? Marcus laughed. Since when do you care about communities? You've spent 2 years destroying companies and displacing workers for profit. Don't pretend you've developed a conscience just because you had a scary morning with some gunmen. The contempt in his voice was designed to wound, to make her doubt herself, to pull her back into the person she'd been. Lydia felt the familiar anger rising, the impulse to prove her strength through dominance. Instead, she thought about Sophie explaining fossil formation with patient enthusiasm, about Evan choosing empathy in the middle of violence, about the woman she was trying to become instead of the weapon she'd made herself into. You're right that I spent 2 years hurting people, she said quietly. I justified it as business, as playing by the rules of a ruthless game, but that morning with those gunmen taught me something important. When you strip away everything else, all that matters is whether you made the world better or worse by being in it. And I don't like the answer I would have had to give. So you're what, reform now? Going to run Crow Capital as a charity? I'm going to run it as a business that creates value without destroying people. I know you can't understand that, Marcus. Your entire identity is built on winning regardless of cost, but I'm done playing that game. She hung up before he could respond, her hand shaking, but her conviction solid. The phone rang again immediately, and she silenced it. Marcus would try to undermine her, would spread rumors about her weakness, would position himself as the strong alternative to her newfound principles. Let him. She was building something different now, something that might not dominate through fear, but could endure through integrity. That evening, Evan called with an invitation to dinner at his place. Lydia arrived to find Sophie covered in flour, attempting to make homemade pizza dough under Evan's patient supervision. Miss Crow, you have to help us. Dad says the dough needs to rest, but I want to make pizza now. The dough knows what it needs better than we do, Lydia said, surprising herself with the patience in her voice. Sometimes waiting makes the final result better. Sophie considered this seriously. Like how fossils take millions of years to form? Exactly like that. Some things can't be rushed. They made pizza together, messy, chaotic, completely imperfect. Sophie insisted on creating a dinosaur-shaped pizza with olive eyes and pepperoni scales. Evan's attempt at a traditional margarita turned out lopsided. Lydia's contribution was simple but carefully crafted, and she felt absurdly proud when it came out of the oven looking almost professional. After dinner, while Sophie worked on homework at the kitchen table, Evan and Lydia sat on the back porch watching the sun set over the modest backyard. "You look tired," Evan observed. "Rough day?" "Complicated day," Lydia corrected. "I let a competitor acquire one of my portfolio companies because they had a better plan. Then my ex-husband called to tell me I'm weak and destroying my own business by developing principles." Evan was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he's right?" "Part of me does," Lydia admitted. "The part that spent 2 years believing strength meant never showing vulnerability, never prioritizing anything over winning. That part is terrified I'm dismantling everything I built. And the other part? The other part remembers having a gun to my head and realizing that all my power and success meant nothing in the face of actual mortality. That part knows I was miserable and lonely and so focused on winning that I'd forgotten what I was even winning for." Evan reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "You're one of the bravest people I've met. You know that?" Lydia laughed, the sound carrying genuine surprise. "I spent most of that hostage situation paralyzed with fear. You were the brave one. I had training for that situation. You're doing something harder, changing who you are at a fundamental level, rebuilding your identity from the ground up, risking everything you've accomplished for the possibility of something better. That takes real courage." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the gesture intimate and grounding. Lydia felt something shift in her chest, walls she'd maintained through sheer will finally crumbling under the weight of consistent, patient care. "I'm ready," she said quietly. Evan turned to look at her, question in his eyes. "Earlier at my building, you were going to kiss me and I said I wasn't ready. I'm ready now." "Are you sure? Because there's no rush." Lydia leaned in and kissed him, cutting off his careful consideration with direct action. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like pizza and possibility. For a moment he stayed still, surprised, then his hand came up to cup her face with devastating gentleness. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Evan was smiling. "That was worth waiting for," he said. "I spent 2 years refusing to let anyone close," Lydia whispered. "I'm terrified of this, of caring about you and Sophie, of building something that could hurt me if it ends." "It could hurt," Evan agreed. "Loving people always carries that risk. But the alternative is the life you were living before, safe and successful and completely empty." "How do you do it? How do you stay open after losing your wife?" Evan's expression softened with old grief. "I stay open because Sophie needs me to model that vulnerability isn't weakness, and because Amy would hate knowing I'd closed myself off to love because losing her hurt so much. She'd want me to live fully, to take the risk, to show Sophie that love is always worth choosing even when it costs." "I don't know if I can be what you and Sophie need," Lydia said. "I'm still learning how to be human instead of just effective." "You're already what we need," Evan replied. "You show up, you try, you let Sophie teach you about fossils and make terrible attempts at dinosaur-shaped pizza. That's enough." Sophie's voice called from inside. "Dad, I need help with fractions." Evan stood, squeezing Lydia's hand once before heading inside. She sat alone on the porch for a few minutes, letting the enormity of what she'd just chosen settle into her bones. She'd kissed Evan Miller, had admitted she was ready to risk her heart, had stepped fully into the terrifying territory of actual relationship instead of strategic transaction. The world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. She just sat in the comfortable evening air feeling more alive than she had in years. The following weeks unfolded with increasing naturalness. Lydia found herself spending more evenings at Evan's house, helping with homework, sharing meals, slowly integrating into the rhythms of their life. Sophie started calling her Aunt Lydia with casual affection that made Lydia's throat tight every time. At work, the transformation continued. Crow Capital's culture shifted from fear-based to trust-based, and while some people struggled with the change, most embraced it. Productivity remained high, but now it came from genuine engagement rather than terror of failure. Not everyone approved. 3 of her senior partners left, unable to adapt to leadership that valued collaboration over domination. Marcus's infrastructure consortium launched with significant fanfare, and several industry publications ran pieces questioning whether Lydia Crow had lost her competitive edge. She read the articles with Evan, curled up on his couch while Sophie slept upstairs. "They think I'm finished," she said, highlighting a particularly scathing paragraph, "that I've gone soft and Crow Capital will collapse within the year." "Do you believe that?" Evan asked. "No, our numbers are actually stronger than ever. Client satisfaction is up, employee retention is up. We're attracting better talent because people want to work somewhere that treats them like humans. But it goes against everything the industry believes about how power works." "So you're threatening their worldview," Evan said, "proving that there's another way to succeed that doesn't require cruelty. That's always going to make people uncomfortable." Marcus is positioning himself as the alternative. Strong leadership, aggressive returns, no hand-wringing about social impact. He's going to be incredibly successful. "Probably," Evan agreed. "And he's going to be miserable, isolated, and eventually destroyed by the same ruthlessness he's built his empire on. Meanwhile, you're going to build something sustainable that you can actually be proud of." Lydia set down her tablet and turned to face him. "How are you always so certain about things?" "I'm not certain about most things," Evan replied. "But I'm certain about you. I've watched you choose courage over comfort every single day for months now. I've seen you transform from someone who used power as a weapon into someone who uses it as a tool for creating value. That's not weakness, Lydia. That's evolution." 3 months after the hostage situation, Lydia received a call from Detective Chen. Marcus Webb and his infrastructure consortium were under federal investigation for bid rigging and fraud. Several of the partners Lydia had known were facing charges. The empire Marcus had built so aggressively was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. "I wanted to give you a heads up," Chen said. "Your name came up in some of the early documents, from your time working with Webb before the divorce. We'll need a formal statement, but preliminary review suggests you weren't involved in any of the illegal activities." "I wasn't," Lydia confirmed. "I left before he started the worst of it, but I'm not surprised he went this direction. We'll be in touch about scheduling your statement. And Ms. Crow, for what it's worth, you made the right call staying away from that consortium. Several people who joined are now facing serious legal jeopardy." After hanging up, Lydia sat very still, processing. She'd been right to refuse Marcus's offer, right to choose principles over profit, right to trust her instincts about his fundamental corruption. The old Lydia would have felt vindicated, triumphant, eager to watch her ex-husband's downfall. This Lydia just felt sad, for the people hurt by his schemes, for the communities damaged by his greed, for the waste of intelligence and capability in service of nothing but ego. She called Evan. "Marcus is going down," she said when he answered. "Federal investigation, probable charges, his whole consortium is imploding. Are you okay?" Not "I told you so," or "you dodged a bullet," or any of the responses her old colleagues would have offered. Just concern for her well-being, checking on her emotional state before anything else. "I'm okay," Lydia said, and meant it. "I'm sad about it, but I'm okay." "Come over," Evan said. "Sophie's already asleep, but I'm up. We can talk, or not talk, whatever you need." Lydia drove to his house, let herself in with the key he'd given her 2 weeks ago, found him waiting with tea and quiet presence. They sat together on the couch, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, and she let herself feel the sadness without trying to weaponize it or deny it. "I loved him once," she said quietly. "Before I knew what he was, before he betrayed me. I loved him and believed we were building something together. Finding out I was wrong about him made me wrong about everything." "You weren't wrong about everything," Evan replied. "You were wrong about one person who worked very hard to deceive you. That's different. It made me afraid to trust my judgment about anyone. I know, but you're learning to trust again. You trust me. You trust Sophie. You're learning to trust yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a long while. Then Lydia lifted her head and kissed him, slow and deep, pouring into it everything she couldn't quite articulate: gratitude and fear and hope, and the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that she was building something real. When they broke apart, Evan's eyes were dark with want, but his expression remained gentle. "Stay tonight," he said. "Not for anything except being together. I just want you here." Lydia stayed, borrowed one of his t-shirts, curled up beside him in the bed he'd shared with his late wife, let herself be held without calculation or defense. They talked quietly about nothing important until sleep claimed them both. She woke to find Sophie standing beside the bed, staring at her with wide eyes. "You had a sleepover with Dad," Sophie announced with delight. "Does this mean you're boyfriend and girlfriend now?" Evan groaned, burying his face in the pillow. Lydia found herself laughing, the sound genuine and free. "We're working on it," she told Sophie. "Is that okay with you?" Sophie considered this with the seriousness of childhood, then nodded decisively. "It's okay. You make Dad smile more, and you're getting really good at finding fossils. Those are important qualifications." "I'm honored to meet your standards," Lydia said solemnly. "You have to stay for breakfast now," Sophie declared. "Dad makes the best pancakes on weekends." The morning unfolded with easy domesticity, pancakes with strawberries, Sophie's chatter about her upcoming school play, Evan's quiet contentment, and Lydia's growing recognition that this was what she'd been missing. Not power or success or the ability to dominate boardrooms, but this simple joy of being part of something bigger than herself. 6 months after the hostage situation, Crow Capital announced a major restructuring. The company would maintain its investment focus, but with new criteria prioritizing sustainable growth, employee welfare, and community impact alongside financial returns. Several major institutional investors threatened to pull their capital, concerned about diminished returns. Lydia stood firm. She gave interviews explaining the new direction, knowing each one would generate criticism from the old guard who saw social responsibility as incompatible with serious finance. "You're committing professional suicide," one particularly harsh interviewer suggested. "Walking away from billions in potential returns to chase some idealistic fantasy about ethical investing." "I'm walking away from returns that come at the cost of people's lives and communities' well-being," Lydia corrected. "And I'm discovering that there's plenty of opportunity to generate excellent returns while also creating actual value. It just requires more creativity and longer-term thinking than slash-and-burn tactics." The interview went viral. Half the comments praised her courage and vision. The other half declared her a cautionary tale about letting emotions override business judgment. Lydia read all of it with Evan and Sophie, the three of them crowded onto the couch, watching her face appear on financial news programs. "You're famous," Sophie said, impressed. "Are you going to be on TV more now?" "I hope not," Lydia replied. "I prefer actually doing the work to talking about it." "But you're good at talking about it," Sophie insisted. "You sound smart and you explain things so people can understand. That's important." Out of the mouths of children, Lydia thought, came truth adults spent years avoiding. She was good at articulating vision, at making complex concepts accessible. She'd spent 2 years using that skill to intimidate and dominate. Maybe it was time to use it for something better. She started accepting more speaking engagements, not at financial conferences, but at business schools, entrepreneur meetups, community forums. She talked honestly about her journey from ruthless CEO to someone trying to build differently. She shared the story of the hostage situation, how coming face to face with mortality had forced her to examine what she actually valued. The response was overwhelming. Young professionals hungry for models of success that didn't require destroying their humanity. Experienced executives burned out on the traditional model and seeking alternatives. People who'd been hurt by predatory business practices finding hope in the possibility of change. Lydia found herself becoming something she'd never intended, a voice for transformation, for the radical idea that strength and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. 1 year after the cafe, Lydia stood in the same location for a memorial service. The city had commissioned a plaque honoring the victims and celebrating the everyday heroes who'd prevented tragedy. Marcus, the young gunman who'd chosen differently, was there, released on probation after testifying against his co-conspirators, rebuilding his life with genuine remorse and determination. He approached Lydia hesitantly. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you said during the investigation, about how I'd made the right choice eventually, how that should count for something. The prosecutor said your statement was part of why I got probation instead of prison time." "You earned it," Lydia replied. You made the hardest choice at the worst possible moment. That deserves recognition. I'm studying social work now, Marcus continued. Trying to help kids who are where I was, angry and desperate and about to make terrible choices. Trying to be the person who reaches them before they hurt people. That's good work, Lydia said. Important work. After he left, Evan appeared at her side, his hand finding hers naturally. You advocated for him? He asked. He chose courage when it mattered most. That should be rewarded, not just punished for what came before. The ceremony began. The mother whose child Evan had calmed spoke tearfully about her gratitude. The mayor praised the first responders, and then, unexpectedly, they called Evan and Lydia forward. These two civilians acted with extraordinary courage, the police chief said, presenting them with commendations. Mr. Miller's tactical intervention and crisis de-escalation prevented multiple casualties. Miss Crow's quick thinking and willingness to risk herself for others exemplified the best of human nature under extreme duress. Lydia accepted the commendation feeling like a fraud. She hadn't acted heroically. She'd been terrified, paralyzed, saved by Evan's competence rather than her own courage. But as she looked out at the crowd, she saw Sophie beaming with pride, saw the mother whose child had survived, saw Marcus trying to rebuild his life, and understood something important. Heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about choosing courage despite fear, about taking action even when paralyzed, about deciding that other people's well-being mattered more than your own safety. She'd done that. Imperfectly, messily, but she'd done it. After the ceremony, as they walked back to Evan's truck with Sophie between them holding both their hands, Lydia felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe, or just acceptance of who she was becoming. Sophie wants to know if you're moving in with us, Evan said casually. She asked me this morning to ask you officially. Lydia stopped walking. What do you want? I want you to know you're already family, Evan said. Whether you live with us or keep your penthouse, whether we get married or stay exactly as we are, you're part of us now. But yes, I want you to move in. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life together instead of just visiting each other's separate lives. Sophie was watching her with hopeful eyes. We could turn the guest room into your office, and you could help me with my science projects all the time. And Dad would be so happy because he's always happier when you're here. Lydia looked at them. This man who'd saved her life and this child who'd saved her heart and made the easiest hard decision of her life. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. Sophie shrieked with joy and threw herself at Lydia, who caught her easily now, swinging her around in a circle before setting her down. Evan pulled Lydia close, kissing her soundly while Sophie made exaggerated gagging noises. You're stuck with us now, he warned. Sophie's already planning where your fossils will go in the collection room. I have fossils now? You have 43 fossils, Sophie corrected. I counted them in your bag last weekend. They need proper storage and labeling. The logistics of combining households took weeks. Lydia sold the penthouse, donated most of her expensive furniture, kept only the pieces with actual sentimental value. She moved into Evan's modest house and discovered she didn't miss the lake views or the designer everything. She missed nothing about her old life except the person she was becoming while living it. Crow Capital continued to evolve. The restructuring succeeded beyond Lydia's expectations. Turns out there was significant demand for investment strategies that created value without destruction. Her fund attracted new partners aligned with the mission, and within 18 months they were outperforming the traditional model on both financial and social metrics. Marcus Webb went to prison for 6 years on fraud charges. Lydia felt sad about it, but not guilty. She'd chosen differently, and that choice had made all the difference. 2 years after the hostage situation, on a Saturday morning at their usual quarry, Evan knelt beside Lydia while she carefully extracted a particularly beautiful trilobite from limestone that had been forming for millions of years. I have something to ask you, he said. Lydia looked up, hands dirty, face sweaty, completely happy. Yes? You haven't heard the question yet. I don't need to, Lydia replied. Whatever you're asking, the answer is yes. Evan laughed, pulling a small box from his pocket. Lydia Crow, will you marry me? Will you build a life with Sophie and me officially, legally, forever? Will you keep teaching me about business ethics while I teach you about fossil formation? Will you be my partner in everything? I already said yes, Lydia reminded him, but she was crying now, happy tears that she didn't try to hide. But yes again, forever yes, absolutely yes. Sophie appeared from around a limestone outcropping, screaming with excitement. I helped pick the ring. Dad let me help. Do you like it? The ring was perfect, simple, elegant, a small diamond surrounded by fossilized coral. Beautiful and meaningful and completely them. It's perfect, Lydia said, letting Evan slide it onto her finger. You both did an excellent job. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony that would have horrified the old Lydia. No country club, no designer everything, no guest list designed to impress industry contacts. Just family, close friends, and the people who actually mattered to them. Sophie served as maid of honor, taking her duties with extreme seriousness. Claire cried through the entire ceremony. Several of Lydia's Crow Capital team attended, still adjusting to their CEO being genuinely happy instead of just successful. Detective Chen came, representing the police department that had responded to the cafe. Marcus, the reformed gunman, sent a card congratulating them and thanking Lydia again for believing he could change. The vows Lydia wrote spoke honestly about transformation, about choosing courage, about learning that strength looked different than she'd imagined. You saved my life twice, she told Evan, her voice steady despite tears. Once in a cafe with your courage, and once in the months after with your patience. You showed me that armor isn't strength, that vulnerability isn't weakness, that the bravest thing I could do was risk my heart. I love you. I love Sophie. I love the life we're building together, and I promise to keep choosing courage, keep choosing connection, keep being the person you've helped me become. Evan's vows were simpler, more direct, perfectly him. I saw you at your worst and chose to see your potential instead of your armor. You've exceeded every expectation, not by being perfect, but by being willing to try. You make me better. You make Sophie's world bigger. You make our family complete. I love you, and I'll keep loving you through whatever comes next. They kissed to applause and cheers, Sophie bouncing with excitement between them. The reception was held in Evan's backyard, their backyard now, with string lights and simple food and dancing that went late into the evening. Lydia danced with Evan, with Sophie, with her sister, with friends and colleagues, feeling lighter than she ever had in designer heels at formal galas. Late in the evening, she found herself alone for a moment, standing at the edge of the yard watching the celebration. Claire joined her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. You look happy, Claire said. Really happy, not just successful. I am happy, Lydia agreed. Terrifyingly happy. I'm proud of you, you know. For surviving that awful morning, yes, but more for what you did after. For choosing to change instead of just doubling down on who you'd been. I had good motivation, Lydia said, watching Evan spin Sophie in circles while she shrieked with laughter. And I had people who believed I could be better than I was. You're going to be an amazing stepmother. I'm going to try, Lydia replied. That's all any of us can do, right? Just keep trying, keep choosing courage, keep building something worth having. Claire clinked her glass against Lydia's. To trying, and to second chances that turn out better than first ones ever could have. They stood together watching the celebration, and Lydia felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was her life now. Messy and real and built on foundation of actual connection, rather than strategic transaction. It wasn't perfect. It would require constant work, constant choice, constant recommitment to vulnerability over armor. But it was hers. Truly, completely hers in a way her empire had never been. Years later, when people asked about Crow Capital's transformation, Lydia would tell them about the worst Tuesday morning of her life, about guns and terror and a maintenance worker who turned out to be so much more, about choosing to change instead of just surviving, about rebuilding from the foundation up, about discovering that real strength required tenderness. She'd tell them about Sophie's fossil collection, which now took up an entire room in their house and included specimens from quarries across 3 states, about Evan's quiet heroism in everyday moments, the way he showed up for people without fanfare, the way he chose empathy even when anger would be easier. She'd tell them about learning that success measured in dollars and dominance was hollow compared to success measured in relationships, growth, and impact. That you could be powerful without being feared, strong without being cruel, successful without being ruthless. And when they asked if she missed her old life, the penthouse, the power, the reputation as someone not to cross, Lydia would smile and shake her head. "I don't miss it for a second," she'd say. "I was winning everything that didn't matter and losing everything that did. Now I'm building something real. And that's worth infinitely more than any empire." The cafe where it all happened eventually reopened, the bullet holes repaired, the shattered windows replaced. Lydia and Evan returned exactly 1 year after the reopening with Sophie in tow. They sat at the same table where Lydia had mocked his worn jacket and calloused hands, where she'd been so certain of her superiority. "I was such an ass," Lydia said, looking around at the space that held so much history. "You were hurt and scared and using cruelty as armor," Evan corrected gently. "That's different. I'm still sorry for what I said, how I treated you." "I know, but look what we built from that terrible beginning. Proof that worse starts can lead to best endings." Sophie was examining the memorial plaque the cafe had installed, reading the names of everyone who'd been present that day. "This is where you and Dad met," she said with satisfaction. "Where our family started." "It is," Lydia agreed, reaching for Evan's hand across the table. "The worst first meeting that ever happened, and the best thing that ever happened to me." They ordered coffee, cortado for Lydia, black for Evan, hot chocolate for Sophie, and sat together in the space where everything had changed. Where Lydia had faced mortality and found transformation. Where Evan had chosen courage and changed multiple lives in the process. Where a terrified child had been calmed and saved, setting in motion a chain of choices that led to redemption. Outside, Chicago continued its eternal rhythm. Inside, 3 people who'd found each other through trauma and chosen to build something beautiful from it sat together in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and existing in the profound ordinary of family. Lydia looked at her husband, at the stepdaughter she loved as fiercely as if Sophie were her own, at the life they'd built together, and felt gratitude so intense it bordered on pain. She'd been given a second chance when she deserved only the consequences of her cruelty. She'd been shown a different way to be strong by a man who understood that power without compassion was just violence with a suit. She'd been saved not just from gunmen, but from herself. And she'd chosen every day since to honor that salvation by being better, trying harder, loving more openly than she'd ever thought possible. The worst Tuesday of her life had become the foundation for the best years. Proof that transformation was possible, that people could change, that courage could be learned, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was choose vulnerability over victory. Lydia Crow had built an empire on ruthless efficiency. But sitting in that cafe with the people she loved, she understood that she'd built something infinitely more valuable on the ruins of that empire. A life worth living, filled with people worth loving, grounded in choices she could actually be proud of. That was victory that mattered. That was strength that endured. That was the ending the worst beginning had earned through courage, transformation, and the fundamental human capacity for change. And it was more than enough.